Cooperative Legacy Project, interview number 31, May 2nd, 2006. We're visiting with South Dakota Farmers Union President Emeritus Ben Radcliffe. Ben, where and when were you born?
I was born in Woolsey, South Dakota in 1915. And the town doctor, Dr. Cogswell, delivered me, I'm told, in a small two-story house in here in Woolsey, South Dakota. My dad operated a small cream station there at that time. And later, the cream station became unprofitable, and he went farming, and I moved to the farm.
Okay. Where was your family from originally?
Well, my father's family are British, and my mother's side are Norwegian. The Radcliffes came from Liverpool, England. And I visited there in Liverpool and looked at the phone book and actually tore out some pages with lots of Radcliffes there. And in 1983, my cousin and I organized an all-Radcliffe reunion, and we contacted our British cousins. None of them came, but they put us in touch with some cousins that we have in Australia. And some of them came, and now we've been, some of them have come over here, and we've been visiting and communicating with them ever since. But yeah, my father is English, my mother is Norwegian. Her grandmother was born in Oslo. My grandmother, their parents were born in Oslo, and his parents were born in Bergen, Norway. So that's my heritage.
Mm-hmm. You had brothers and sisters?
I had 5 siblings. There were 4 of us boys and 2 girls.
Mm-hmm. What were their names?
Well, my oldest brother's name was Amos. He farmed around Tular until about 1961, and he moved to San Diego, where he lived until he died 2 years ago. My second brother's Max. He lives in Los Angeles. He is now 92 years old, doing quite well. He's had some health problems, but he's doing well. I have my oldest sister, and I'm the next in line. My sister, who is a year younger than I, lives in Texas. They retired. She and her husband retired in Weslaco, Texas, and she lives in a healthcare complex down there. And my younger sister, Vera, married Melvin Price. They still live in Tular. They farmed. The youngest of the family, William, was in the Navy, came out and went to work for the post office and worked for the Postal Service until he retired, and now is retired in Lake Havasu, Arizona. And we correspond with each other all the time. We have computers and email, and we keep together.
What was your father's name?
My father's name was Oliver. That some kind of a family name, I guess. I don't know of any other Olivers, but I'm sure it was a family name.
Mm-hmm. What sort of a person was he? You want to talk about?
Oh, my dad was a great guy. As times were in those days, I can't remember he'd ever given me a hug or ever said. I cannot remember sitting on his lap. And he never told me he loved me, of course, and but I know he did. We had that kind of relationship of father and son that I had great respect for him, and I know he did for all of us too, because times were tough during the 1930s, and he saw that we all got a high school graduation at least, and some had a little more education. We lived 5 miles from school. In the winter, when the roads were blocked, he would get up in the morning and harness a team, and we'd go with a sled or a wagon to Tular, and he'd stay in town all day and bring us home at night. So he did. I'm sure that he did everything he could for his children. No, he didn't. There was no emotional show as far as my dad was concerned. My mother was a little more emotional.
Mm-hmm. What was her name?
Her name was Emma Olson, and she was born in Brookings County And she told us that she was probably the last person born in Brookings County while South Dakota was still a territory. In 1889, South Dakota was still a territory. And she grew up in a large family. And my grandparents, Olson grandparents, continued to live in Brookings County. And we'd go see them maybe once a year. We lived near Woolsey. With a Model T Ford. I recall I've got pictures of the Model T Ford with the top down. It was about maybe 80 or 90 miles over there, and we never went over there and back in the same day. It was always a 2 or 3 day trip because it was too far to go in one day. That's my mother's family.
Your dad, if I remember the first interview correctly, didn't serve in World War I, but you have some uncles that did?
Yes. My dad was relatively, older than what they wanted. But I had 3 uncles. My father's brothers served in World War I. One of them was killed in the Black Forest battle, I think. It was right near the end, within a few days of the end of the war. And the other 2 boys, my uncles, never went overseas. Well, my grandmother was, my Radcliffe grandmother was called a Gold Star Mother because they had a program in those days where the mothers could go visit their son's burial site over in France. I think they gave her an option. They would move the remains back here, or she could go there and look at the burial site. A nice, beautiful cemetery, and she chose to go over there on a boat. There were no planes flying across then. She and a lot of other Gold Star mothers went to France, and later on, when I was president of the Farmers Union, and we had an IFAP meeting in Paris, I wanted to go see that cemetery in France, about 75 or 80 miles from Paris. And I didn't really want to drive that Paris traffic. And George Stone was along, former president of Oklahoma Farmers Union. And I said to George, I'll rent the car, I'll buy the gas. Do you think you could brave this traffic? George said, let's give it a try. So George and I and Dorothy and Mrs. Deschamps.
Just go ahead.
Mrs. Deschamps had some relatives, some veterans over in that part of France too. But anyhow, we all went over there, and it was on a holiday. I wanted to buy some flowers, but the shops were closed. And we arrived at the cemetery, and the caretaker had a nice home right next to the cemetery. We visited with him. He went out in his garden and picked a nice bouquet of flowers and gave it to me and showed us where the cross was of my Uncle Clifton. And then he took some Polaroid pictures as we stood right there. And my wife and I beside Uncle Clifton's cross, and I mailed them back. And, of course, my family all made a big fuss about it. But that was the story.
Okay. One other thing that happened about the same time, well, at the conclusion of the war, of course, that has a lot of interest for people these days with the worries about bird flu is the Spanish flu epidemic that was the last fall of the war in 1918. Do you have any? You don't have any direct memories of that, but you probably heard about it.
Well, actually, my wife's father, Mr. Simons, died in 1918 of the 1918 flu, we called it. And it came on quickly. He'd helped one of the neighbors had helped him with his harvesting, and it was his turn to help the neighbor, and he didn't feel well enough to go, but he thought he should. And within 3 days, he had died. They died quickly. It was a respiratory thing. And several people had passed away with that flu in the community. And when it came time for his funeral, the authorities decided that it was not wise to hold funerals inside a building anymore, so his funeral was held outside the building. And that was in 19, and my wife Dorothy then was, I think, 2 or 3 years old. She never remembered her father, but she remembered a lot of stories about it.
Yeah. Now, do you remember living in Wolsey, or were you too young when I think you moved out to a farm or something?
Yeah, I was pretty young when I lived in Wolsey. We moved out to Vernon Township in Beadle County. I don't remember any part of my town life. And I started going to grade school in Vernon Township. I think in that township there were still 4 schools, one in each corner of the township. And I went to that Vernon Township school along with all of my siblings. And I think when I was in the 6th grade, we moved again. We moved to Sand Creek Township, which is farther west in Beadle County. Sand Creek had pioneered in that they'd built a rural school with 12 years, first through 12th year, and they had a fully accredited 12-year school system out there. And my dad was on the school board, and I went to school there through 7th and 8th and freshman year, and then agriculture was tough, and we tried another place. We moved up to Tulare, where I finished my high school education.
Mm-hmm. You want to talk a little bit about attending country school back in those days? I've talked to people who had attended in later times, and I'm sure it differed a little bit as time went on. But you had.
Well, we lived 2.5 miles from school, and when the weather was right, we walked to school. We cut across the fields and across the pasture. We didn't go around the road. It was closer to take the shortcut. When the weather was bad, we drove a pair of horses hitched to a wagon. I had older brothers. Every rural schoolhouse in those days had a barn, because some kids rode to school, and some people drove. Our neighbors had an old mailman's buggy, which is boxed in completely, windows in front and holes in the front for the horse range to go through. Sometimes we caught a ride with them part way home. Our teacher lived in Huron, I think, which was about 15 miles away. And she drove out every day. And there was, of course, no bathroom in the school. There were 2 little biffies, one for the boys and one for the girls. There was no running water. We got our water from a neighbor's house, which is probably 1/4 mile away. And it was kind of a Jack and a Jill thing. We always felt it was a real honor if 2 of us got to go to get the water, and we'd bring home a pail of water between us. And it was an enjoyable time. When we look back, those were kind of the good old days where everybody was sort of poor, but we didn't seem to mind. I want to tell you once about we had no electricity, and every year in the fall, it seems that the teacher wanted us to put on some kind of little program for our parents to come in, get better acquainted with the parents, and see how we were doing. And one particular night, we had that program in the fall. It was cold outside. We had no electricity, but a lot of the neighbors brought in lamps, and the gasoline lamp was quite popular then. You put gas in, pump it up, and you have a mantle, you get gas. I get light. And the program was going on, and pretty soon people began to nod, and the lights got dimmer and dimmer, and finally someone realized that we run out of oxygen in there, and they opened a couple of windows, and the lights came back up, and the people brightened up. But that was one of the things that was sort of commonplace in those days. And from 1921 to 1926, I went to that school.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We're in the 1920s. What was farm life like in the 1920s?
It was fun. We went barefoot all summer, of course. My dad farmed with horses. We didn't have a tractor until I was a teenager, and then some. We had a lot of community activity. You didn't have a radio. We had social events, literary events. It seems to me that about twice a month we would all gather in the schoolhouse, and the adults and the kids, and we would put on little acts. My dad played a guitar, my mother played a piano a little bit, and I don't recall if we ever had a lot of dancing, but we had a lot of fun, and we'd recite little stories. And the first time I ever saw a radio was, I think, in about 1926 or 27, when somebody announced they were coming to the school to show how a radio worked. So he came with an Atwater Kent black and white box that did nothing but squawk and squeal during the whole time he was trying to show us how it worked. So even in those days, we didn't have a radio. When we played ball at school, we'd like to play baseball, especially in the fall. When the World Series was on, that's big time. We'd choose upside, and somebody would always want to be on the Yankees team. They always played, and whoever else. And we never knew when the World Series were going on, we never knew who won the game until the next day when the Daily Plainsman paper came out. We grabbed that, took that along to school to show whether we were on the right team or not. But no, see, communications was really slow, but that's the way it was, and we didn't know any other kind of life than what we had right out on the farm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That would have been about the same time that the steam power on the farm was giving way to tractors.
Yeah.
Do you remember the thrashing time?
Yeah.
Probably with steam engines yet?
Well, the first thrashing was done with steam engines. Actually, my father had a thrashing rig, a big case tractor and a Rumley thrashing machine. He called it a separator. We kids called it a thrashing machine. And it was a huge thing. The rear wheels were at least 6 feet tall, maybe taller. And he used it not only to thresh, but to break sod. And they'd hitch 8 or 10 bottom plow with a wooden beam, slanted wooden beam, and permanently placed moldboards on the beam, and they would just make a swath, 6 or 8 or 10 feet wide going down the prairie. He did some of that. He did breaking for other farmers. I remember mostly, of course, the threshing part. Now, some of the rigs were steam, but they were getting more and more to gasoline when I was a teenager. And, of course, we all took our share of bundle hauling and pitching bundles into the threshing machine and hauling the grain away. Mm-hmm. Everything done by hand. We scooped grain into grain bins where the door or the hole in the bin we were scooping into was probably 4 feet above the bottom of the wagon we were scooping from. And so it was a lot of hard work.
Mm-hmm. Was there kind of an art to getting the grain through the whole thing without losing any of it?
That's right. We lived at my grandmother's place for a while, and she's standing out in the yard and says, "Ben, you're spilling too much grain." And the chickens are down there, maybe even the pigs. Yeah, that was a real art. We didn't like to do that, but somebody had to do it, and quite often we did. We milked, when I was when I was a teenager on the farm, we milked 20 to 25 cows, and of course that's how the farmers made their living, because quite often we didn't harvest very much. But we always got up before school, before breakfast. Went out and milked those 20 cows, and then came in and ate breakfast, and then cleaned up and got ready to go to school.
Were you marketing the milk, or were you
the cream? We separated the cream with a hand separator. Mm-hmm. And then my dad was still involved in the cream business, and he actually ran a cream pickup route to Huron twice a week. And when he was busy in the field, my mother would make the drive, and I was a kid, and sometimes she'd take me along. And that had to be in about 1929 here in Huron. At the movie theater, they showed the first talking movie. Before that, it had been silent movie, They have a piano player that played mood music, but here my mom says, "Hey, Ben, they've got a movie in town that talks." So we went to the talking movie, and I was pretty proud that I was the first kid, that got to go to the talkie. So life on the farm was, it was pleasant, it was fun. We didn't have any. Some of the neighbors lost a boy with diphtheria. A disease was prominent. They didn't have the cures for it that they have now, but I think we're fortunate. Nobody broke any arms or any legs, and we just had a happy farm life.
We hear a lot about, of course, the fact that there was a lot of polio happening. Of course, President Roosevelt, I think, probably came down with it sometime during the 20s. Was there a lot of concern about that?
The polio hit this part of the country after I was an adult, and sometime in the 40s, I think. And, there was a lot of concern, and people quit going to swimming pools. It seems that was one place that was spreading, or large gatherings. And then the Salk vaccine, I guess that's what it was.
Yeah.
And then the community, I suppose the county ordered it. We had a time when we all came to town and met in the arena or someplace, and we were all given some kind of inoculation. But some of my friends, many of them had polio and were crippled, and they never did recover. Of course, polio is something you didn't recover from.
Yeah. A lot of families had, there were bigger families back in those days, I suppose, both for work on the farm and because they were afraid of losing a child at some point.
Yeah, it's always we're always worried with the disease and the accidents on the farm, but we were fortunate.
The farm economics during the 1920s were not all that good. I think prices went down considerably after World War I. Do you remember anything about the economic situation when you were a kid?
Well, I was born in 1915, and from 1918 to 21, farm prices were great. Wheat, I think, got up to $4 a bushel.
Over 100% of parity.
Over 100% of parity, and many homes. As a matter of fact, I bought a farm in 1952 where the home was built in 1920 during the good times. And many homes around, and especially in South Dakota, were built or improved at that time. And unfortunately, many farmers thought that prices are going to be here forever, and leveraged, borrowed money, mortgaging the quarter that they owned, and bought another one, and it turned into a situation where I'm told that nearly half the farms in South Dakota were lost because they couldn't pay the taxes, couldn't pay the banker, and simply had to walk away and go and rent a farm somewhere.
There were a lot of banks that failed during that time. Did that impact around here a lot?
Of course it did. I don't know that we had a lot of money in the bank. Some of my relatives did. My grandmother did. The banks went broke, and it was a major disaster. And then, of course, as Franklin Roosevelt, we all gave Franklin Roosevelt the credit for bringing the country back together. But when the banks went broke, that was the whole community, and people committed suicide. You know the stories.
Well, you're out there on the farm in the 1920s. What did you want to do? Did you want to farm? You thought about what you'd like to do in life at that point?
Well, no, I can't say that I really did. I don't know. In those days, you sort of assumed that you'd farm like your dad did, as most people did, or planned to. I was interested in science. I loved the science classes, but I don't recall that I had any. In the first place, I couldn't imagine where my dad would find enough money to send me to school, and so my parents made the major effort to get us all through school, and I had an aunt that was teaching school, and she paid the tuition for my oldest brother Amos to go to Huron High School for 1 year. He had a teacher's certificate. But none of the rest of us went to school. My younger sister Vera, I think, she went to Dakota Wesleyan and got her teaching certificate. And my youngest brother Billy, after he got out of the Navy, He took some GI courses. Mm-hmm. But no, I didn't have any big dreams of being any prominent person.
Did your siblings end up in farming? We talked about where they were later on, but did they all end up farming?
Well, my older brother Amos did. My sister Ruth did. My sister Vera did. They're all farmers. My brother Max, older than I, went to California, worked in the CC, Civilian Conservation Corps, as I did later. And my younger brother Billy went out of high school right into the Navy. So I can say that 4 of us continued in farming in one way or another. Mm-hmm.
And where did you all went to high school? Where did you attend high school at?
Well, we started high school in Sand Creek Township in Beadle County.
Mm-hmm. They had a high school out in the country?
Yeah, it had a 12-year school. 12 years,
Was that kind of unusual?
It was unusual. We were one of the pioneers. Someone was pretty progressive, and it was at least 10 miles from any town, and it was a 12-year high school. I agreed in high school. I went there until I was a freshman, and then my dad moved us to Tuller where I finished in the Tuller school system.
Mm-hmm. What was high school like in those days?
Well, we didn't have a lot of options. When I went to high school, they told us what subject to take. We didn't have any options. We had English, of course, and history, and science, and literature, and we had four subjects each year. And we had 4 high school teachers. Superintendent was one of them, and 3 others. There were totally 4 high school teachers, and we had about 80 kids in school, 20 to a class, grade. And that was it. And compared now to all the different teachers and varied options you have. We had few options. We went to school, we got our diploma, and we were out of there.
Mm-hmm. You remember anything about the stock market crash in 1929? Did that impact out here to the extent that...
No, the stock market, we didn't realize too much about the stock market. We were too close to home where...
You were already having...
We already had a crisis right here with what was low grain prices and drought, and the stock market was just something we read about.
Yeah.
And we didn't feel any real impact from the stock market.
There's a new book out that entitled "The Worst Time," and it's about the Dust Bowl experience in the 1930s. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Obviously, it hit here in South Dakota as well. Some of us have seen pictures of the farm by Woolsey that was buried in dust, it seemed like.
It's unreal. It's hard to believe that actually happened. Where the dust would blow and blow day and night, and the tumbleweeds would blow into a fence row, and of course that would stop the dust the same as a fence stops snow. And the dust would blow, and eventually, many cases, and I started farming in a farm like that, where the fence row was totally covered with sand. If there was a large bush or a small tree out in the middle of the field, that would be a huge sand mound. And that went on for several years, and that land became, pretty cheap. You could buy it pretty cheap. So when I started farming, I got an FHA loan, and I rented 2 quarters of land with a home on them, on the farm, and had this kind of a dust thing. In those days, the Soil Conservation Service would come out with their equipment and level off the land. They'd run their blade along the fence, take the sand away from the fence, and help get this land back into a level condition so we could farm it. Mm-hmm. But it was unreal what happened then. So we leveled off the land, and we farmed it, and it's still, that farm and the land still blows. We have to farm it in a certain way now to control the erosion. We don't plow it anymore, and we use a lister to leave ridges in the field to keep the land from eroding.
Mm-hmm. Are trees planted?
Yeah, well, one of the farm programs one of the Roosevelt programs was plant tree strips, and you got paid for that. You got paid to do that, and so a lot of farmers planted tree strips. We had tree strips.
So how did you survive? You're probably, you're burning corn cobs and things like that in the wintertime?
Yeah, we burned corn cobs and we burned corn.
I was doing that again, I think.
And I think it's profitable. Right now, a gallon of gas costs more than a bushel of corn is worth. And you do the arithmetic and you find out it's a lot cheaper to burn corn. But we did. With cobs, of course, we always had pigs. And we'd go out in the pig yard and pick up the cobs if the pigs had eaten the corn off the ear. And our neighbor had an old tree belt, and that some trees were dying, and he let us cut wood out there. But we still had to buy some coal. And so one day my dad went to town with the wagon load of oats to buy some coal, and came back with just a little pile of coal in the middle of the wagon box. And so we tried burning corn. And my dad, it's awfully hard for him to see that corn burn. But it did, and it heated pretty well, and you had to get up more often to fuel it. But we burned corn one winter quite a lot, and it was a way to get through the winter.
Of course, there's a lot of stories of the farm holiday movement in South Dakota. Do you remember anything about that?
Not too much. Not too much. I've read more about it than I recall. I've read of farms, and I guess there were some of this going on where the people would get together and refuse to bid, and the sale would be called off after things were sold ridiculously cheap. But I never was involved, nor was my dad involved in any of those things.
So you get out of high school in what,
1933.
33, and what do you do then?
That's a good question, Chuck. That is a good question. I worked for a farmer for a little while there, and then my parents signed me up to join the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a Roosevelt program that did miraculous things to get hundreds, thousands of kids off the streets and off the farm into productive work, and generally in the mountains or the hills. I went to. They sent me. I say my folks signed me up because I don't recall asking to do that. I just remember all at once I was there, and I ended up in the Black Hills for a couple of months, where we worked on fire trails and roads in the hills, and then our group was sent to Arkansas, where I spent 6 months all winter near Fort Smith, Arkansas. And we lived it must have been an old Army barracks camp because it was all built to accommodate our size of group. And those CCC camps were set up in such a way that they used the military. Each camp had a captain and a lieutenant or two, and there were maybe 200 or 300 of CCers. And we every morning we saluted the flag when we got up. Out in the hills, we lived in large military tents, 12 cots to a tent, and it was pretty much military restrictions and orders. We didn't dare leave. We thought that'd be AWOL. Nobody did that. But that again was a fun time. We were paid $30 a month. Of that, $25 was mailed home to our parents, and we kept $5 a month. And then of that, we paid $1.25 for laundry and something else. We ended up with about $3.50 a month. But our food and our clothing and everything we needed was provided. We had a little money to play poker with, and once in a while we'd get to town. Oh, and then they...
if you went to town, what town would that be?
Fort Smith or Little Rock.
Little Rock.
I went to Little Rock a couple of times. That was an interesting town.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had a plan where a couple of times a year, some group, I don't know who it was, would bring 2 or 3 busloads of girls out to our civilian camp and would have dances. Mm-hmm. I didn't have, but they brought them out in big trucks, a bunch of girls. And of course, that was great to get the girls out on the camp. And we had all kinds of sports. We had baseball and boxing and whatever we wanted to do for recreation. But we built a lot of fire trails, fire roads up in the Ozark Mountains. Mm-hmm. And it was a challenge. Somebody who was some of the older ones in our group would be designated as the leaders of the little party. We got 5 or 6 at a time to do this brush clearing and tree chopping. And some old miners that came along and helped us learn how to blast stumps out. Mm-hmm. And I stayed in there until spring. I think it was probably 1934, and I came home and worked for a farmer. And then my oldest brother, had gone to Washington State to pick apples the year before, Wenatchee. And he said, let's do it again. So Amos and I and another friend of mine boarded a freight train in Tulare.
You just kind of jump on like hobos?
Yeah, we're like hobos. We were hobos. Yeah. We were hobos. And in those days, there were a lot of hobos. There were a lot of guys on there. And we got on the train, and my folks took a dim view of this. But we decided to go. I was out of high school. Rode the train to Aberdeen, switched trains, and headed west. And it took 3 or 4 days to get there. We were riding different open box cars. And when we went out, the weather was pleasant, and we didn't get cold. We picked apples. We got a job on Wenatchee picking apples. And I don't recall what we got paid, not very much, because by the time we got ready to come home, we were broke again already. So we came home, and I remember we got home on Thanksgiving Day. And we'd ridden the train through Washington, and Idaho, and Montana, and North Dakota, and it was cold. In those days, you were looking for a warmer place. And on the train, they had cars in which they carried fruit and vegetables, and they kept those sort of partially heated. And sometimes you could slip inside one of those where it was warmer, but it was cold when we came home. When we went to Aberdeen and then south again to Tulare and got home on Thanksgiving Day, it was cold, and the darn train didn't stop. It was going 20 miles an hour. Amos and I said, well, we're going to bail out. So we did. We threw out our bag, and then we followed it, and we all tumbled and rolled a while, but we made out okay. Got to town and didn't have a telephone. Finally caught a ride home 5 miles from home, and we were glad to be back home. Mm-hmm. That was an adventure. Yeah, riding the train.
Did they have like railroad police? In those
days? Yeah, they had railroad bulls, and many times we'd be chased off. But we'd get back on again. And one thing we did when it was cold, we'd climb on the train right behind the tenders, or where the coal was carried. They burned coal in those freight and those steam engines. And a big coal train right behind the steamer, right connected to it, and there'd be a fireman down there shoveling into the big furnace. And we'd climb up and get, down in that coal where we could feel the heat from the furnace coming up there. When we got home, we found out we were pretty dirty. But it's amazing what kids did in those days. They probably do worse things now, I don't know. But that was our experience.
Okay, and what did you do when you got back then? You find your way back home?
Yeah, I found my way back home, and I worked. And then I got married just a few days before I was 20 years old. I married a local girl that I'd gone to school with, and we had a job on a farm near Huron.
Her name was, you mentioned her last name.
Her last name was Simons, Dorothy Simons. Mm-hmm. And Dorothy Simons' mother was living. She was a widow. She'd never remarried after her father died in 1918. And she was keeping house for a man here in Huron who owned 3 or 4 farms east of Huron out by the Jim River. And she talked to him, and he hired me to live on one of those farms and farm. That was a strange situation. There were 2 black families worked for this same Mr. Brummel. He had a lumber yard and a coal shed here in Huron. And his son managed the farms. There were 2 black families and 2 white families. And we farmed that year. That was probably in 1936.
Tough year.
Yeah, it was a tough year. And the grasshoppers ate everything. I still remember the grasshoppers, they piled up on the fence posts on the north side to be in the shade, and they were piled up on each other, and you just rake them down with a hand. But we didn't raise much that year because of tough weather. But I had an uncle who lived in California who managed a ranch out in the foothills near the Mojave Desert, Lancaster. And he was here visiting, and his daughter had appendectomy, and he needed to get back, and his wife was going to stay and drive back with the kids. And he said to me, why don't you drive your car back to California, and I'll go with you, and you can work on the ranch. We had a 1929 Chevrolet, 6-cylinder Chevrolet, my wife and I, married at that time. And so we headed out for California. I think it took us several days. They didn't have a lot of paved roads in those days in 1936. We broke a wheel, had to stop at a ranch house and borrow some tools to fix that. And got out to California, and I worked on that farm. And talked about, there were Mexicans working there, and we got paid $1 or $2 a day if we were lucky. But a friend of mine said, why don't we go to the gold mine over here at Acton, California, which is 20 miles away. Maybe we can get a job in the gold mine, and we did, and we were hired. I was hired, at least. Mm-hmm. He never got on.
How long were you involved in the fruit picking there?
Oh, well, yeah, that's right. Before I went to work in the gold mine, we were itinerant fruit pickers. Mm-hmm. That was one thing we did while we were off-season farming. Farming is off-season. Times not any work to do. And in the fall, we picked a lot of pears and some peaches. And we would live in a tent near the orchard, and we would pick fruit. And quite often the women would get jobs working in the packing plant. This fruit all had to be brought in and washed and sorted, went down on a conveyor belt, and somebody had to sort them out and pick them up. But the good ones here and the bad ones there, and box them up, and that was the packing shed. Packing shed, it was called. And I think I did that a couple different falls during the growing season. I picked walnuts one year. 2 years I picked walnuts. And the way you pick walnuts is walnut trees are large. You can't climb them to pick the walnuts. So you have a long bamboo pole with a large hook taped to the end with friction tape. And you stand on the ground and shake the limbs. And then you gather up the walnuts, and they're still in their green covered pods. Mm-hmm. And you put them in the sack, and then we were paid so much a sack, $1 a sack or whatever for picking walnuts. And I made as much as $10 a day picking walnuts, which was an outrageous amount of money, Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, after farming and picking walnuts and pears, I did get this job in the gold mine. It was named the Governor's Mine, because it was owned by a former governor named Governor Gage, who was the governor of California about the turn of the century, last 100 years ago. And he owned that mine, and his son managed it. And so I went to work in that mine and worked there for about 4 years, and I got $4 a day. I'm sorry, $5 a day. I started out as a mucker, just shoveling the ore. And the ore came out of there in pieces that you could generally handle. And the average of a ton of ore was worth about $30 a ton. That was a pretty good average. Because gold was pegged, I think, by the Roosevelt administration at $32 or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I worked there for 4 years. Then after I was a mucker for a while, I became a miner. And a miner operates a drill, pneumatic drill. We had, pneumatic power down there. And then the last year I was there, I was elevated to shift foreman. Mm-hmm. I had 20 guys work for me, under me. And at that time I was making $12 a day. And that was a lot of money. So I got excited and I bought a brand new Chevrolet in 1941. My wife thought that was great. Nice little red Chevrolet. Mm-hmm. Paid $1,015 for it. And
cash.
Yeah, cash. No, I didn't pay cash. No, I had to finance that.
You financed it.
Yeah, I did that. Right. I got out of the financing business shortly after that, but
yeah,
that's not good. Yeah, I had to finance that.
Yeah.
But anyhow, in 1941, December 7th, we woke up in the morning and started listening to the radio and didn't have a television, and we learned that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and rumor was that they were going to move right into the West Coast, and we're out in California. And so we got orders to turn the lights off at night. When we drove cars at night, to put a blue shield over the lights if we had to be out. And we sort of waited for something to happen, and something didn't, except they rounded up all the Japanese out there, mm-hmm. and they corralled them and put them in camps, and some of those camps, I think, are still, even today, are still there to look at. But then they closed down the gold mine by federal mandate. Every gold mine, including Homestake Mine here in South Dakota, was closed down in early 1942. Mm-hmm. The government needed a lot of steel in mining, and timber, and a lot of explosives, and of course the manpower. Mm-hmm. So they closed down all the mines, including ours. And so here I was in...
So what was the general attitude of the guys working there? Did they feel like did they want to go to war, or did they want to...
Well, a lot of the young guys...
Go find some safe spot.
A lot of young guys, joined, yep. They're patriotic. They joined.
Yep.
At that time, my wife and I had a daughter, Donna, and I didn't really want to go to war, and they weren't drafting us at that age, that soon. Mm-hmm. No, the attitude was, we've been attacked, and we've got to react.
Yeah.
And everybody was patriotic, Mm-hmm. But it was 1st of March, and I called home and talked to my aunt and uncle who were living on the homestead, and they said, well, come on home, and we can sure use you on the farm.
Yeah. So
I came home and farmed with them one year, and then I got a loan and bought my own farm in 1942. Yeah, the fall of 1942, I bought a farm.
Did you have any thoughts at that time? A lot of people went out to work in the war plants. Did you have any thoughts of doing that?
No, I didn't. Some of my friends did, and you've interviewed, I think, some of my friends who have gone out there. No, I didn't. I had a place to farm. My dad was farming. My brother was farming. And the country needed farmers in those days. They needed wheat, they needed corn, they needed food. They were rationing food. We all had ration stamps. We had sugar was rationed, and meat was rationed, and gasoline and tires were rationed. And if you blew out a tire, you had a real problem. If you got a new tire, you had to go to the county office and get permission to buy a new tire. Mm-hmm. And we in our community, we just sort of hung around, and everybody was farming.
Yeah. And the farm economy was considerably improved with the needs of wartime.
Yeah, that's when farm prices began to go up, and during the war, of course, gas was rationed, and the price was determined. There was a limit on the price of hogs. They set the price of hogs to, I think, $14 a hundred, and everything else was pretty much structured. But the price was good enough, so we were making money again. After a long time of virtually no money made in agriculture, agriculture began to turn up. And 45, 46, 48, things were getting really good. The farming sort of had come into its own then as a place where farmers were even beginning to play golf. Never heard of.
Yeah. Now, in the early years of the war, they came up with some sort of a system to determine some sort of a deferment for people who were going to be farming. I've talked to some other people who were farming. How did they go about reaching those kind of decisions?
I really don't know. They had A, B, and C, or some plan. You qualify if you were a farmer or some occupation that was essential to the war effort. Is the way they talked about it. If you were in a factory making tanks, obviously you were exempt. If you were farming, you were exempt. And I don't know, in some cases, students were exempt from the draft. There was a procedure that was pretty well set and pretty well followed. I didn't pay much attention to it because they put me in a category that that I didn't need to be concerned. I wanted to stay home and farm.
What was life like on the home front here? Then, besides, obviously, you're making a little bit more money than you were.
Well, for a while there were a lot more girls than there were guys around. They were in the Army. Of course, I was married. That wasn't a concern of mine, but it was obvious that there were more women than there were men.
Was there a shortage of farm labor at all with so many people?
There was a shortage of farm labor, and we did a lot of things the hard way yet then. We didn't, when I started farming, I was still cutting with a binder and using a thrashing machine. It wasn't until I'd been farming 3 years that I converted to a combine. And sure, there was a lot of, and the women began. We saw the women begin not only in the factories but on the farms. We saw women begin to get involved in working. So I think that was a major shift in social attitude and social livings when the women become part of the workforce. And I think our whole social fiber changed at that time. Women went to work and had babysitters. See, when I was young, my generation, our mothers all stayed home. As a matter of fact, a married woman couldn't get a job at teaching school. Single women or widowed women could get jobs, but the county commissioners or the school board would not hire a woman who was married to a man who was making a living. And that's a change that sort of we don't often recognize, but that was a major change in the social structure of our society.
Did they have pretty strict rules about the behavior of the young teachers too?
In school?
I know my mom wasn't allowed to go to dances, but they knew about it anyhow.
Well, it depends on religion, I think. We were Methodists, and they were not too strict. We were allowed to play cards and go to movies, but there were there were a lot of religious restrictions in those days. There are now too. Yeah.
You mentioned shifting over in equipment on the farm. Would that be about the time maybe the war was over when they started shifting back to, or were you able to get some equipment maybe used before the end of the war?
Well, everybody was looking for new. We had money. We were making money. We had more money than and we couldn't find new machinery, so we were remodeling old machinery. We would have a list with a machinery dealer. So when he got a new drill or a new plow in, it'd be our turn. And I don't know, we had money to buy machinery and couldn't find new machinery, so we were repairing old machinery. In those days, rural electrification came in, 1947.
Is that when you got it on your farm?
We got REA on our farm. And one of the first things we did was to buy electric welder, so we could repair our own equipment, and we were never very good at it. Some of us were. And we didn't have to take the machine or apart to town anymore into the blacksmith shop. We could weld it right at home, sometimes right on the machine. Didn't even have to take it off. So we were able to fix up a lot of old machinery. And you couldn't buy new machinery until, the war was over in 46, something like that.
40 August of 45.
Yeah, and it took 2 or 3 years before machinery got back on the line because the factories were all conditioned to make airplanes and tanks and trucks.
Yeah.
So, but once machinery became available, a lot of new machines went out in the country, and farming was prosperous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where was you were farming at? Where was your farm at from here?
The first farm I rented was just a mile and a half southeast of Tulare, South Dakota. I farmed there for 2 years. Then I rented another farm about 8 miles west of Tulare. It's always west of Tulare. In 1952, I purchased a farm 7 miles west of Tulare, east of Tulare, and I still own the land. My kids grew up there, went to high school and the Tulare High School, and my wife and I lived there. And I was in the South Dakota legislature while I was living there, and I lived there until 1961 when I moved to Huron to become full-time president of the Farmers Union.
Mm-hmm. When did you first become involved in Farmers Union, as we get to that part of the story?
Well, it was shortly after I had begun farming on a rented farm.
Your dad had not been active?
No, my dad had belonged to the Farm Bureau, and then he belonged to the Farmers Union a couple of years. He really didn't have any strong convictions. But one day, one evening, a couple of guys drove into the yard and asked me to come out in the car, and we talked about Farmers Union. And they convinced me that this was probably the organization to belong to. And so I paid them $5 and became a member. And the first Farmers Union meeting I went to was in Redfield, and up in the hall, up the second story of some building, and Oscar Fosheim was president of the South Dakota Farmers Union. Oscar was there, and Oscar had been a former legislator, same time Emil Lawrence was in. And Oscar, yeah, he ran for governor. Oscar was a fiery speaker and very persuasive, and by the time he was done speaking, I knew that I'd joined the right organization. And so we had locals, and in those days, still have some now, I guess, but it wasn't long before I was president of the local.
Mm-hmm. What local would that have been?
It had been Crandon local, okay. Crandon Township, Crandon local. At home I still have a big coffee pot and a bunch of little cups that we used for a coffee break after the meeting. We'd meet in homes generally. Meet in homes, Crandon local. We met every month.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much like a township organization?
Yeah, it was. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Several, there were probably in Spink County, there were probably 12 or 15 locals. Mm-hmm. They didn't necessarily center around a town. Ours did not. Ours was very local. Yeah. Very rural, rather. Yep. There were probably about 15 or 20 locals, and most of them met. Mm-hmm. And then later on, I was elected president of the Spink County Farmers Union, mm-hmm. and I tried to get the locals all involved. We had a manager of the Redfield Farmers Union Oil Co-op. Can't think of his name, but I went in and we made a deal, and he would buy the oysters, and we would have an oyster feed in every one of our locals, every one of our 15 locals around the county. Mm-hmm. And we did that, at least 1 year, maybe two, and that generated a lot of interest. But a lot of enthusiasm in those days for Farmers Union, and there still is, but a few farmers, of course. Mm-hmm. So that was, and then I don't know how it happened. I got on the state board, State Farmers Union Board. I went to the district meetings. Oh, I was elected district chairman first.
Yeah, they had just split one district into two districts.
District 3 had been split because it had too many, and they created District 7. Lloyd Larson was president of District 3, mm-hmm. And I was the first president of District 7, which included Huron, Spink County, Hand County, and District 3 was further east. Mm-hmm. And I was the president of the District 3 Farmers Union, which sort of automatically projected me onto the state board. And so I served on the state board. Paul Upsall was president. Paul was a great guy. At that time, the state headquarters was in Mitchell in a rented place. Mm-hmm. And Paul wanted to build a farmers union headquarters. We all did. So we talked about it for a couple of years, and then we had a meeting. And I was not on the board then. But it was a long, long meeting, state meeting, debates and discussion about where to build. And some very flowery speeches were made. Those guys real orators in those days. Mm-hmm. And we decided to build it in Huron. So they hired an architect, and in 1952, we built this building. Paul Upsall was president. And Paul then decided to retire. And Harold Gosseth, I think, was Paul's vice president. I believe that was it.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right.
Anyhow, Harold Gosseth was elected president of the Farmers Union. And I was on the board then, and I was elevated to vice president. We had an election. We had to win it. Mm-hmm. Gosseth and I were running against John Skaggy mm-hmm. and Norman Olson.
Yeah.
They were the team, and it was Gosseth and Radcliffe.
Skaggy had been president back in the 40s.
Yeah, Skaggy had been president once before.
Olson, wasn't he on the
GTA board?
Yeah, but wasn't he on the state board too at that time?
I think he probably was.
One maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was a spirited campaign, and Gosseth and I won.
Mm-hmm. There was a close connection in those days with the co-ops. You want to talk about that a little bit? You mentioned the fact that the co-op manager in Redfield was buying oysters for your locals.
Well, yeah, I think that the Farmers Union and co-op was almost synonymous. Mm-hmm. You talked about Farmers Union, you were talking about the co-op right away, and the co-op managers, for the most part, were very dedicated mm-hmm. Farmers Union members.
Yeah.
And you're right. There was a mm-hmm. closer association.
Yeah. Now you were involved with some of the co-ops up there too, weren't you?
Well, I was
board in addition to Farmers Union.
I was elected to the REA board. Mm-hmm. I wasn't one of the first, but I was on the REA board within a couple of years after it begun. Mm-hmm. And then I was a very faithful patron of the Farmers Union Oil Co-op. I never was on their board, but we organized a credit union. In those days, credit unions pretty much were organized around a certain business. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, one credit union serves a whole area. But I helped, and I was chairman of that credit union for several years. Mm-hmm. And it helped farmers who couldn't get a loan from the bank, get a small loan from the union, or from the credit union to pay their bills and stay in business. And it served a real purpose. And then after a while, credit unions began to get larger and larger, and mm-hmm. and we just closed that one down.
Yeah.
But it ran for several years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Were there a lot of them that were geared to farmers that way?
The credit unions?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Today they seem like more of an in-town thing.
Yeah, well, they were then too.
Thing, yeah.
But then the government came out with some programs, rural credits or something like that. That's not the right word. Where farmers could borrow from the government without having to go to their banker.
Mm-hmm. A Farmers Home Administration.
Yeah, and that and another lending agency where they could go right to their. And so the credit unions built around the co-ops and didn't serve the purpose that they had done earlier.
Okay. Now you, we're going to go a little bit longer here, but
okay.
You got involved in politics too. How did that happen?
Well, I suppose Oscar Fosheim had been in politics, and I admired what he had done. And I think it just naturally led from being involved in the Farmers Union to being involved in politics, because so much of what happens to us and the things we do or don't do are related to politics.
Mm-hmm.
So up in Spink County, I was helping some people run for the legislature, and one year it seems that there's an opportunity to run, and so I filed a petition and ran for the House of Representatives. I beat an incumbent.
What year would that have been?
That was in 1954.
Mm-hmm. Was George McGovern was one party secretary?
George McGovern had taken over the party. Well, I'll go back to 1952, which some people remember as the Eisenhower landslide, where everybody voted for Ike. I like Ike. And there were only a handful of, matter of fact, there were only 2 Democrats in the South Dakota legislature in 1952. And they came from Charles Mix County, where no Republicans ever ran because the Democrats always won.
Mm-hmm.
2
this
Democrats.
was pretty much of always a Republican state, but almost always. But that would have probably been just about the low point for Democrats, wasn't it?
It sure was. I'm sure it was. And then George McGovern stepped in. I don't know why, but he decided to take over the Democrat Party. It was faltering and failing, and I don't know what inspired him to do it. But he talked to a bunch of people, including me, and I decided to run in the 1954 election.
Mm-hmm. So it's like January of 1955, and you go to Pierre for the first time. What was that like? Was
well, I'll tell you what.
Or what?
That was a little bit of an emotional thing when I left my family. When I left my family at home to go to school and take care of the chores. And they'd never been left at home before alone.
Mm-hmm.
And here I am, jumping in my car in January and driving to Pierre and saying goodbye, and a lot of tears, I'm telling you. And I'm not too sure what I'm doing. You know, what's going on here? I'm leaving my family, go to Pierre to serve the people of Spink County.
You had 3 daughters.
I had 3 daughters going to school.
Take care of them.
But Dorothy was very brave about it.
Yeah.
And so were the daughters. They held up well. But that was really an emotional experience for all of us. But I wanted to do it, and so I did. And in those days, the pay wasn't much. They paid $600 for the full 2 years, and they paid travel round trip, 3 cents a mile, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all. There was no expenses paid other than the $600. So we didn't make a lot of money.
But no per diem, like
no per diem. No, but I tried to get home almost every weekend. I tried not to neglect the business in Pierre, but on Friday I'd head for home as a 2-hour drive. Then Sunday night I'd go back. So we had good weather. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, most of those. I was there for 8 years, but the sessions just met biannually in those days. So it was 4 sessions I went to.
Did you ride with some other legislators some of the time?
Oh, once I did. A few times I
We're all probably Republicans.
Yeah, Charlie, the guy from Han County, he's Republican. And I rode with him a couple of times, but no, it's pretty much a single drive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the roads in January could be pretty bad. There's a long strip between Highmore and Miller. If there's any snow moving at all, it's moving right
was
there.
Was that a paved road in those days yet?
Yeah, it was a paved road. Yeah, it was a paved road by then. Mm-hmm.
Okay. How many Democrats were there in the House at first?
I'm thinking that in the House there were, I believe there were 17 of us. There were quite a few. There was Ralph Nauman. Mm-hmm. And Ralph Herseth was in the Senate. Mm-hmm. But we'd gathered up, quite a lot of support, and we were still dominated, of course, by the Republicans.
How big was the House? The House was bigger in those days.
The House was bigger then. Right now the House is 70.
Yeah.
I think the House was
100.
Maybe close to 100.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot more rural legislators, obviously.
Oh yeah,
today.
a lot of farmers.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of farmers, and at that time, Yeah, I represented Spink County and part of Clark County. I don't know how they divided it up.
And this would be at a time you were the Democrats making some gains here in South Dakota? You'd gone from almost nobody to 17 in the House. That's still probably comparable to what it is today.
I think so. We made some gains. They were slow though.
Yep.
It wasn't until Dick Knight became governor, and I was no longer president of the Farmers Union. Yes, I was too. Yeah, Dick Knight became governor. I was no longer in the legislature. Dick became governor when we did for a short period of time. The Democrats had a majority.
Did the Democrats get a majority in part of the legislature in '58 when Ralph Herseth was?
No, we never did. We came close, but Ralph never had a majority. I don't think.
If you were making any gains, what was it? Was it the economy, the farm economy? I think I remember hearing about the antagonism toward Ezra Taft Benson, and what I think somebody referred to as apparently somebody threw something called hand grenades at him.
Well, eggs and tomatoes.
Yes.
Eggs and tomatoes. Yeah, Ezra Taft Benson helped build Farmers Union, and I suppose helped change the political complexion too. But, South Dakota, I don't know why we're so Republican here, but they are. We tried to get the farmers, as you know, for a while, for several years. Yeah. We did a survey after each election, tried to determine whether the vote from the farm was Democratic or Republican. And it showed in those days that the farmers were the more Democratic voters, although in Sioux Falls, labor union had a block of Democrats. But a lot of the Democratic vote came off the farm.
Okay. Well, we've come up to about 60 questions here, and this seems like an appropriate spot.
I'm running out of voice.
Yeah, it seems like an appropriate spot to adjourn and perhaps talk about maybe scheduling a follow-up here.
Okay.
Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 31, Part 2, May 9th. We're visiting with South Dakota Farmers Union President Emeritus Ben Radcliffe. Ben, we were talking about politics coming up into the late 1950s, about the time you became Farmers Union President. And there were a number of names here that I was going to run by you and let you comment on these individuals if you wanted to at all. They were sort of dominant personalities out here that you had some association with. Emil Lorix.
Well, Emil Lorix was a great pioneer in Farmers Union as we know it today. He was, of course, a war hero, a pilot. And when he came back from the Army, he became interested in politics. And he ran for the South Dakota Senate legislature in any event, and was elected a time or two. And then his attention somehow focused on Farmers Union. And for a short time, he was president of the Farmers Union. And then he got involved in GTA, Grain Terminal Association. And he was chairman of that board for several years and made a major contribution, I think, to agriculture in South Dakota.
Oscar Fosheim.
Oscar Fosheim was the president of the South Dakota Farmers Union when I was recruited to be a member. And the first year that I joined the Farmers Union, I went to a county Farmers Union meeting in Redfield where Oscar Fosheim was the speaker. And he was a very eloquent speaker. I was more convinced than ever after visiting with him that the Farmers Union was the organization that I wanted to become a part of. Oscar Fosheim also ran for governor, state of South Dakota, and he was in the legislature. Oscar made a contribution in his own way to agriculture in South Dakota.
Mm-hmm. Paul Opsahl.
Paul Opsahl was president of the South Dakota Farmers Union for, I think, about 10 years. He lived in Aberdeen. He never did move to Huron, where the headquarters was. Actually, when Paul Opsahl became president, the headquarters of the South Dakota Farmers Union was in Mitchell. And Paul engineered through the process of choice and elimination as to where the state headquarters should be built. And so in 1952, Paul was the president. We built the South Dakota Farmers Union office here in South Dakota, where, of course, it still stands. And then during my presidency, we built an addition onto the building, and the north side is the new part of the Farmers Union. Paul was a good state president, well respected.
Your immediate predecessor, Harold Golseth.
Well, Harold was a state legislator. I didn't know Harold very well until I got involved with the Farmers Union State Board. Harold was vice president, I think, to Paul Opsahl. And when Opsahl retired, Harold ran and became president, as I recall. And Harold was only president for about 2 years. He had health problems, and I was his vice president the time that he passed away in, I think, 1961. And I was actually I was out in Pierce serving in the legislature when he passed away, and I got the call that Harold was gone and they needed somebody to give directions here. But I continued to serve in the legislature for the full 60 days. And then I began acting as the officer in charge of South Dakota Farmers Union. I was vice president, so I took over.
Mm-hmm. N.W. Thatcher.
N.W. Thatcher was kind of a favorite of mine. He was really a pioneer in the cooperative business. As I recall it, he was bookkeeper for some grain firm, and he could see that the grain dealers were pretty much ripping off the farmers badly. And so he organized or helped, or got a lot of help, and organized a grain cooperative that turned into a huge grain cooperative. It's still in business, and they called it Grain Terminal Association, GTA. And Bill Thatcher headed that he was the manager. He was manager of that for years and years, and did a great job. He was, he had.
A little opinionated sometimes.
Yeah, that's the word. He was opinionated, all right. But don't take that away from him. He was one of the great co-op leaders of our times.
Unfortunately, a guy that nobody's ever written a biography of yet.
That is unfortunate, because at one time somebody was writing, I heard they were going to write a book about Bill Thatcher, but I never saw it evidenced anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Jim Patton.
Oh, Jim Patton was my mentor and my ideal as far as a farm leader was concerned. He was tall, he wore a patch, and he was over one eye. He was known for that image. But he was a great farm leader, and he would invite people to the national conventions who were Washington figures. John Kenneth Galbraith was one of the favorites that Jim would invite. And there were many others like that brought to the membership of the Farmers Union an opportunity to hear and look at some really great people in our country who were in Washington and made the wheels turn.
Another cooperative leader, Emil Siftestad.
Emil Siftestad, I never knew him too well.
Mm-hmm.
He was the manager of the Farmers Union Central Exchange. No, actually, I just met him a few times. I thought he was doing a good job.
Yeah, okay. Getting back closer to home, Art Jones.
Oh, Art Jones and I were in the legislature together in 1950, 55 and 57. And we worked closely together there, and Art also was a pioneer in the real electric industry, and he, I think, was the first chairman of the East River Electric, and he and Hanlon and Ken Holm, some of those great leaders of those days, put together East River Electric, which was really a great organization that brought together several counties in South Dakota to utilize the value of the power that generated out at the river. Mm-hmm. Great guy.
Ken Holm, you also mentioned.
Yeah, Ken Holm was he was in the Interior Department in Washington, D.C. And before that, I knew him when he was a legislator.
Ran for the Senate.
Ran for the Senate. I campaigned for him. And I think he ran against Francis Case, but I'm not sure. Anyhow, at midnight, Ken Holm was ahead, but after they counted the West River votes, Ken Holm did not win. He never did win. I think he may have run more than once for a congressional seat. But he did go to work in the Interior Department. And Ken Holm's son, of course, you may be talking about that, John Holm. Mm-hmm. John Holm worked for the South Dakota Farmers Union for several years.
Mm-hmm. Ray Fitzgerald.
Oh, Ray was another one of the great guys. He was on our board, the state board, for a while. He came from Plankington, and he really headed up the Farmers Union down there. And he went to Washington, too, in some official capacity in the USDA.
ASCS, wasn't it?
Yeah, okay, yes, yeah, whatever. It's the Department of Agriculture. Mm-hmm. And, Ray passed away a while ago. But he was a good friend of the Farmers Union and a good guy. Also
served as Secretary of Agriculture here in South Dakota.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He did serve as Secretary of Agriculture in South Dakota for a while, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. The guy he served for, Ralph Herseth.
Well, Ralph was I think he was in the Senate. I believe Ralph was defeated in 1952, the year of the Eisenhower landslide, when only 2 Democrats were elected to the legislature. And then Ralph was reelected he was elected again in 54, and I served with him in 55. And in 56, I think Ralph ran for governor. Mm-hmm. He ran for governor in 58, and he won. And that's right, Ralph was and then Ralph's son Lars was in the legislature, and now Stephanie. And you look back to her, says, I've left their fingerprints on politics in South Dakota for over 50 years.
Yeah. Some people who served in the Senate, Carl Munt.
I didn't know Carl Munt very well. Carl Munt had a tremendous memory. He could remember names like no one I've ever known before. A guy worked for Carl Munt called, whose name was McCoy, was really a decent guy, and my contact with Munt's office was always with McCoy. But Munt served South Dakota for a long time. Apparently, people liked him. They kept re-electing him.
Mm-hmm. Hubert Humphrey.
Well, Humphrey, it's just too bad that Humphrey never was president of our country. I tell you, things would have been a lot different if he had been. I knew Hubert personally. My trips to Washington, D.C., I quite often visited with Senator Humphrey. It's too bad that we lost him.
George McGovern.
Well, George is sort of my mentor in a way. I'm older than George, but he took over the Democratic Party after the 1952 fiasco, and the Democratic Party was about as low as it could be. And George took over as the executive secretary and encouraged a lot of us to run. And in the next election, in 1954, there were 17 Democrats elected to the House and 7 to the Senate. Well, I'm not sure George can take credit for all that, because the pendulum obviously had swung some. Mm-hmm. And George entered the political arena at the right time as far as getting Democrats involved. And, of course, George ran then for Congress in 1956. And then he had his career as senator and Food for Peace director. And then finally his race for the presidency, which I got involved in quite a lot. I went to Iowa and campaigned for George. And during the primary in 1972, I spent a week in California campaigning for McGovern, which he won the California primary. And George is great to see. I'll see George in a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. Jim Aberesk.
Oh, Jim Aberesk sort of came out of nowhere. He was a West River guy. I don't know what the name of his town out there.
He was down on the reservation.
Yeah, he and his dad his family ran a store at Mission. Mm-hmm. And here's Jim Aberesk, who came from nowhere. His name was on the ballot. Nobody could pronounce it. And I thought he was going to have a tough time winning that, but somehow he was able to win that election. And then he later went to the the United States Senate, where he only served for one term and just didn't run again.
Yeah.
And Jim is still very involved. He's a lawyer down Sioux Falls, and he's got an activist.
Mm-hmm. Dick Knipe.
Dick Knipe from Salem was a state senator, not while I served, but while I was president of the Farmers Union. We helped Dick whenever we could, and he helped us after he won the election. Dick wanted the state income tax, as did Farmers Union. That was our goal. And we came within one vote, as I recall, of getting a state income tax. At that time, the Senate passed it, and the House missed by, I think, one vote. And we're still struggling. Mm-hmm. But Dick did a great job. Mm-hmm.
Bill Janklow.
Well, Bill Janklow, there are two sides to Bill Janklow. He can be antagonistic and difficult. And on the other hand, on the other side, Bill Janklow had a very progressive side. He wanted to get things done. And sometimes everybody didn't agree with what he wanted to get done, but he got it done anyhow. He's that kind of a guy. He could get it done. He helped save the railroads in South Dakota. Farmers Union became involved. His only supporter from the agricultural sector in saving the railroad system in our state was the Farmers Union. And so the state bought something like 1,000 miles of railroad track. We passed a sales tax to legislature passed a sales tax to raise $20 million to buy the track, and it's been very successful in South Dakota.
Okay. Now we're going to go into some more issue-oriented and so on questions. It's the spring of 1961, and you're suddenly president. Had you thought about that at all when you ran for vice president? The Gulseth was not that old.
No, he wasn't, and no, I hadn't really thought about it. I was on the Spink Electric board, REA board, and I was busy farming, and I was in the legislature, and I didn't really need a lot of other jobs. And so I hadn't. I was surprised. I was shocked. I knew he had bad health, but no one thought he would go like that.
Mm-hmm. But you, as you said, you completed your term before coming to Huron. Were there any major issues going on in 1961 in that last legislative session you served in?
I can't really recall. Well, the one thing that we did that's sort of been almost forgotten up until, now we're talking about 61, okay, mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're always supporting tax reform, but I can't, that's a long time ago. Mm-hmm. I can't remember anything there.
You mentioned you moved to Huron. Opsal had lived in Aberdeen. What had been the situation with presidents as far as them living in the same place that the office was? Had that been kind of all over the place? I mean, had they not necessarily followed any particular tradition up until that point?
Well, I'm not too sure. John Scoggie was president. I'm not too sure that he lived here. Upsall did not live here. Harold Goseth lived here when he was president, and I did, and of course Lee Swenson did. I've always felt that it's probably better for the organization if the president was, in the office often. Mm-hmm. And I was in the office virtually every day that I wasn't on the road somewhere. But times change, and sometimes to get the best people in office, you have to do things that are unusual.
Mm-hmm. You became president at the same time that John Kennedy was being inaugurated nationally. Would you like to talk a little bit about the relationship between the Farmers Union and the Kennedy administration as it was coming in?
Well, we immediately had good rapport with John Kennedy. Jim Patton was president, and Jim was in Washington, and Farmers Union did well under the Kennedy administration, as short as it was. We got some good appointments in the Department of Agriculture, and I don't know where to go with that question, Chuck. It's just that everybody, and especially the farmers, liked the program that Kennedy brought to Washington.
Yeah. One of the ongoing, seemed like annual events of the 1950s and into the early 1960s were the wheat referendums.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that as an element of farm policy development? I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the only instance that we've had where the farmers actually got to vote on the farm policy that they were going to be living under.
I think that program dated back maybe even as far as Harry Truman, when we had 100% of parity, and Charles Brannan was the Secretary of Agriculture, and a program was developed that gave the wheat farmers an opportunity to vote every year, every 2 years, I've forgotten what it was, to decide whether they wanted to continue in the program. And of course, the Farmers Union was a strong supporter of the wheat program, and for a yes vote on the referendum. But there were large farmers and another farm organization that was constantly preaching as a best opportunity for farmers to get the government off their back and farm on their own. And so one of those years, I don't recall the year, Jim Patton was out in South Dakota campaigning with us, but the wheat referendum was defeated barely.
I think 1963.
Probably 1963.
And if I'm not mistaken, you could correct me because you probably remember better. I think it carried in all the plains states where they really produced wheat, and it lost because they included people who had as little as 15 acres of wheat in the Corn Belt.
I'm sure that's right. It was the program was manipulated in such a way that our friends were not in office then, and it was manipulated in such a way that it was defeated.
Mm-hmm. Was that a significant blow to farm policy at the time? I know it seemed pretty important out where we lived in North Dakota because we were really in the wheat country there.
I think it was a significant blow to farmers. Price supports or supply managements, what way else explained it. The Department of Agriculture anticipates in advance how much wheat we need to satisfy our domestic need and world needs, and they target those numbers of acres to be planted. And the farmers agree to plant within those limits in exchange for a guaranteed fair price. Mm-hmm. And so it was a supply management program that made a lot of sense. And you have to look at any other maker of product, the car dealer, the machinery maker, the washing machine dealer, a manufacturer. They all produce as much as they think they can sell. And we thought, well, this is the way that agriculture should be handled too. We know about how much we're going to market. Let's target that and produce that much and maintain a price. So that was our philosophy, and we thought it was a good one. But as we've talked about, the administration manipulated the eligible voters to the point that we lost the wheat referendum. Mm-hmm.
Another significant issue for those years that was ultimately probably at least as controversial as farm policy was water. I think there's a photo, if I'm not mistaken, of President Kennedy dedicating the Oahe project, and I think you're in that photo.
That's right. We, Farmers Union, we were strong supporters of the development of the Missouri River, and Farmers Union supported the Oahe irrigation part of the development. That became very controversial. But at the last convention where that was discussed, our delegates continued to support the irrigation project.
Mm-hmm. What do you feel was the significant problem that resulted in the Oahe project not happening the way it had been planned? Obviously, earlier on, it had very strong support.
Yeah.
What went wrong as far as the change in attitude that caused enough opposition to succeed in derailing it?
That's a question that I cannot answer. Earlier on, you were right, the Bureau of Reclamation had a public meeting in Huron over at the high school auditorium. It holds maybe 400 people. There were twice that many people in that building. They were standing around, and the support was unanimous for the Oahe. And there were farmers in there and businessmen. Mm-hmm. And so then the government put a lot of engineers into this area to work up the project. And hey, I thought we were going to have it completed, but opposition arose. And here's the part I can't explain. But they developed a lot of following, and they used very aggressive tactics in getting the people, their supporters, to meetings. They had a system where they could, on call, bring in 30 or 40 or 50 of opposition people and bring them into a meeting and literally dominate the meeting. And they did that successfully, and in the end, when Jimmy Carter was in office, Haberask was our senator. Somehow we lost the support. And I still don't know quite what the root of all this was, but I know what the result was.
Mm-hmm. You think that the economic situation in central South Dakota would be different today if the project had been built?
Yeah, I do. We would have had a lot of irrigation in Spink and Beetle County. You can only speculate that would be good for us. I'm not sure. We'll never know because it didn't happen.
Yeah. In the mid-1960s, Jim Patton, in your early years, Jim Patton was still president. He'd been president for, 25 years?
I think so.
When he stepped down.
Mm-hmm.
He left office in 1966. You want to talk a little bit about Tony Deschamps and him becoming National Farmers Union president? He had been on the staff, I think.
Tony was from Kansas, where he'd been involved in politics. And then when Jim Patton became president, somehow Tony appealed to Jim. Tony was a pretty sharp young guy in those days, and Jim needed somebody as a sort of a front man for him to develop programs, and Jim hired Tony. It was a great choice. And then Tony grew, of course, in experience, and when Jim was ready to step down, Tony was the one to take over. Although Tony had never been a farmer, he grew up in rural Kansas, but he had the ear of the farmer, and he sensed the need of the farmer. And he took over where Jim left off, and I think we're all surprised how well Tony moved the Farmers Union right along in the same direction that Jim Patton had been moving us.
Quite a dynamic public speaker.
Yes, Tony was a great speaker.
Occasionally offended a few people with his language, but he believed in what he was talking
absolutely, about. Absolutely, Tony talked what he believed, and he told it the way he believed it, and that was Tony.
Yeah. International relations during the early 1960s period, there were some programs like the Latin American project that Arlene Schley, who was your education director, got involved in. How did that get started? I think she told the story. You may have read that in the paper.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Arlene knows a lot more about that than I do. I was not present when that started. Mm-hmm. I came in while it was in progress. And I think it was through the Department of Agriculture, but I'm not sure. And, we participated in that. And some of our people went down mostly in South America.
Mm-hmm.
Then they had the groups come up here,
Mm-hmm.
and we held public meetings, and it was a good exchange of mostly farmers.
Mm-hmm.
It was a good program for the Farmers Union.
Okay, well, another thing that I think you've had an interest in for a long time, probably way before you were president, and I think you still do, and that were the farmer worker conferences that were held here in South Dakota.
Yeah, that was a great. I didn't initiate that either. When I came on board, that was already in place, and it was an annual affair. Farmers Union realized that there are not enough farmers in our state. This is a state organization. There are not enough farmers in our state to influence the legislature the way we'd like to, and so we looked for a coalition. And the leaders in the labor movement in South Dakota in those days were very friendly toward our suggestion that we form this coalition. So then I wasn't there, but somebody decided we should have annual coalition farmer worker meetings. And these meetings ran for 2 days. And we'd generally meet in a hotel, and labor would bring in some of their main speakers. Walter Reuther never came, although some of Walter Reuther's aides came. And Jim Patton almost inevitably came when he was on board, and Tony did too. These farmer worker conferences, and we discussed issues, and we decided on issues that we could both all support. And later on, we brought in the teachers. SDEA came in so we had a coalition of farmers and workers and teachers, and it was very effective, I thought. Somewhere down the line, it fell between the chairs, and I have suggested to President Doug that maybe he should re-explore that farmer labor coalition and the teachers.
Mm-hmm. You think maybe that with regard to to labor anyhow, as opposed to the teachers, that perhaps the decline in strength of organized labor in South Dakota has had some influence on that?
There's no doubt about that. And then the personnel changed in the labor unions. And
Cliff Schrader was a good supporter of the conferences.
Cliff was, and then who was the
Jack Dudley.
Cliff was there when I was really involved,
Mm-hmm.
and Jack Dudley followed through. But when Jack Dudley left, there seemed to be a lack of interest on the part of labor to have a coalition with our group at least.
Mm-hmm. Another area in the terms of internationalism, Farmers Union was there right there at the beginning of the founding of the United Nations after World War II.
That's
I
right.
want to talk about the Farmers Union relationship with the United Nations. And as I recall, when I started, we were having United Nations luncheons at our state convention.
Yes, of course. United Nations was something that's supposed to bring an end to world strife, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a prime leader in that after FDR was dead. And Eleanor Roosevelt came to South Dakota when the arena was new. I don't recall what year that was. Eleanor Roosevelt filled that arena one night talking about United Nations. And then there was a National Association, United Nations Association, I guess we call it, and each state had one, and we had one. It was kind of a formal organization where we elected officers, and we had a day annual meeting to talk about promoting the United Nations because, it hadn't been adopted by our government, and the Farmers Union is very supportive of it. So was Jim Patton. Jim Patton was a leader in putting together the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. What do you think was the reason why a number of rural people ultimately became anti-United Nations? Was it just the isolationism that tends to sometimes prevail in rural America?
I think that's true. I think rural people tend to subscribe to an isolation feeling, partly because we are isolated. We're out here, we're rugged individuals, and we tend to think that we can make it alone. And so there was some disappointment in the United Nations, and there still is today. But it was a good move that we got involved in, no question about it.
Mm-hmm. Uh, 1963, of course, President Kennedy was assassinated and Lyndon Johnson became president. What sort of relationship did Farmers Union have with Lyndon Johnson?
Well, Johnson was a different kind of a guy. He was a great politician. As we all know that he was very persuasive, and that was the reason of his success, I think, mainly because he could convince people to adopt his views. I think the farmers liked Lyndon Johnson. I always liked Lyndon Johnson. I thought he got a bad rap because of the Vietnam War, but Lyndon Johnson did a lot of things for America. Medicare, just a lot of social programs. President Johnson was going to abolish poverty, war on poverty he had, and he did a lot of that. And a lot of that, of course, is we've seen it backslide now till we've got a lot of poor people that Lyndon Johnson would not have tolerated if he'd been the president. But I think Farmers Union liked Lyndon Johnson.
And of course, you mentioned the 1960s is also the era of the Vietnam War. How did the war impact Farmers Union? I've seen some discussions at recent conventions with regard to war and peace issues, and I imagine what it must have been back then.
Well, I don't know. Vietnam was unpopular from the beginning, and it became more and more unpopular. But farmers are sort of conservative. They don't get out and demonstrate. And so there was not a lot of discussion about Vietnam at our conventions. It never really became an issue. But, it was unpopular.
Johnson actually made his last public speech before that he announced he wasn't going to run for re-election in 1968 at the National Farmers Union Convention in Minneapolis. Do you remember that?
Yes, I sure do.
What do you remember about it? Were there protesters outside? Minneapolis being the area that it is.
Well, I'm not sure. I know there were when Hubert. You're going to ask me this question. When Hubert Humphrey ran, the convention was in Chicago, the Democratic Convention. I did not go to that. That's one, and I'd been going to the National Convention, Democratic Convention prior to that for 3 years, but I did not go to that. But I know there was a lot of demonstrations. But Johnson in Minneapolis, somehow that doesn't. I don't recall there was a lot of protesting there.
Okay. Then we come up to the Nixon administration and Earl Butz. Do you want to comment on their attitude toward farm policy?
Yeah. Well, appointing cabinet members is something that presidents always don't get their choice, as we well know. I'm not, maybe Nixon wonder or Butz, I don't know. But the farmers didn't like him, and he followed the philosophy that the government should get out of farming, and he did his best to trim down the Department of Agriculture and eliminate farm price supports and farm program totally. His philosophy was that the supply and demand and the big farmers would take over and produce enough, and we really didn't need to protect the small farmers. And that was his philosophy. And you have to assume that Nixon appointed that secretary that maybe that was his philosophy too.
It was generally in those years that the Farmers Union got concerned about corporate agriculture.
Yeah.
And that, I think, did that begin at the 1968 convention? Because I think I remember seeing the backdrop about who will own farms or something.
I know that's about the time it started. I know when I was president in 1961 or 62, it was a major issue at our convention.
Okay.
And we did we put together a big poster of some kind, sort of condemning corporate agriculture. And were you here then, Chuck, when we got to pull out of the air a fictitious name for a corporate farm, and we posted that. And about 2 weeks later, a couple of guys walked in the door with briefcases, and they said, "We represent this farm that you've been protesting, and we don't really believe that we're entitled to the kind of resentment that you're, spreading there."
Yeah.
And so we sat down and we apologized, and we ran a story in the paper saying that we had no intention of singling or targeting any one corporate farm. But that was an issue. Yeah, corporate agriculture was a major issue.
And you had like several years that you sponsored legislation in Pierce that finally passed, I think, the Family Farm Act in 1974.
Yes.
Just before I came down.
Yeah, I was president of the Farmers Union. We passed the Family Corporation Farm Act, and it has been amended off and on since then. And frankly, I've been out of touch, so I don't know where it is, how it stands now.
Certainly, and I think we touched on this earlier, one of the leading issues in South Dakota during that time was, and probably going back to earlier years, was the need for tax reform. The Farmers Union was involved with an initiated measure, and what was that, about 1970? How did that happen?
That's probably it. Farmers Union for years had supported a personal and corporate income tax, and the legislature had refused to act on it. And so at one of our conventions, we took a position that we would circulate petitions and put it on the ballot. And we did, and we had a very spirited campaign. We were joined by a lot of co-op groups. REA was involved with us, and we raised quite a lot of money, a lot of money was in those days. We were outspent, of course, by the opposition, but we made a respectable showing. But, of course, we lost that battle.
But enough to keep it on the front burner, at least through the Knipe years. Right.
And when Knipe came along with nearly had a majority of Democrats, and he almost passed the income tax bill. You have to wonder how much better we might be off today. Teachers are underpaid. We have lowest salaries because we don't have an adequate tax resource. Really, I think that's a major part of South Dakota's problem, is our inadequate tax program.
Sure. I get to actually pay state income taxes in North
Dakota. Yeah, well, good.
That never hurts my feelings at all. In I think it's 1971, you had the only contest in your 20 years you had for president. Do you want to talk a little bit about that experience?
Well, yes, a gentleman by name, his last name was Wheatilla, who was a friend of mine and was from Brown County, and I think he was on the board for a while. I think he was. And
Vice President, I think.
Vice President. And there was a faction that developed. Now I'm not going to name any names here, Chuck, but a faction developed that wanted to put their own people in office. And so they had projected Wheatilla, and so I called him, and he lived up in Brown County, and I lived here, and we had lunch in Redfield. And I knew the guy, and I liked him well, and I said, you don't really want to do this, do you? Well, he said, they want me to do it. And so he ran. And, well, I didn't take anything for granted. I began to campaign. I actually went, I think, to every county. I took a month, sort of disappeared around here. And took a little leave of absence and took a month and visited a lot of county presidents, and ended up in the convention with plenty of delegates that I didn't have a problem. But you never know when you don't take things like that for granted.
No. And kind of continuing with the tax discussion that we were having before we had that little interlude. Why do you think, looking back over the long haul, even the years after you left office, why do you think it's been so difficult to accomplish tax reform in South Dakota? You did, if I recall correct, succeed in getting the personal property tax removed during your years, and that was something.
Well, let me spend a minute on that before we go to the income tax. Yeah, we take a lot of credit for eliminating the personal property tax, but we actually had a lot of support from retailers. Retailers who had huge inventories in their stores. And every year they were required to take inventory to show what the inventory was this year and what it was last year. And then they were forced to pay sales tax, personal property tax on this inventory. And so it wasn't just the farmers. We had a lot of support from the business people, and that's why that passed. Now, income tax, we don't have that support from the business people. And, the slick talkers can convince some poor people that an income tax would be bad for them when it wouldn't be. And if people were getting the right information on an income tax, it would surely pass, because there's no better tax system than taxing people according to their ability to pay. When you depart from that process of taxing, then you get into pretty mucky waters.
Mm-hmm. Like lotteries and things like
that.
that.
Lotteries. Well, that's another story.
Yeah.
But property bears too much of the burden of local education, local government here, and it will continue to be depressed local communities until we get a tax reform.
Another issue that during the early 1970s was very significant. I think the first thing I ever went to was a beef and boxcars forum, and that was railroads. We talked a little bit about railroads before, but there had been a long battle over abandonment of branch lines. You want to talk about that and the involvement of the Farmers Union?
Well, more than talk about it, it finally come to a showdown. The railroad companies that served South Dakota had announced that in 2 years they were going to abandon certain key lines. And there was a lot of concern, businessmen, politicians, and Farmers Union got involved. We, at our annual meeting, we talked about it and decided we needed to do something. We contacted the legislature, and then we finally contacted the governor, Bill Janklow. And he said, we need to do something. And so Bill, as Bill does, when he decides to do something, he moved ahead and he got a bill introduced into the legislature that assessed a 1% sales tax, leave it on the books until it raised $20 million, negotiated a deal with the railroad companies, and got some federal loans, federal help, and with the help of Farmers Union and Bill and Governor Janklow, South Dakota bought, I think, about 1,000 miles of railroad line. Now, we didn't refurbish all of it. We repaired and rebuilt enough of it to maintain a good artery flow of rail service through our state. And, of course, now, last year, I think the legislature or the governor sold our part back to a railroad that's serving the state.
Mm-hmm. Actually, Harvey Woolman, in serving about 6 months as governor, had kind of taken some initial steps toward doing something about the rail issue. Mm-hmm. Do you think, though, that the Janklow and the railroad was kind of like Nixon going to China, that it's something that the legislature wouldn't have let a Democratic governor accomplish?
Oh, absolutely. I think it was a Nixon in China thing, and this is one thing that Bill Janklow, one of the things that he was able to do. He would do something that the Republicans would never do, but he did it. And we socialistic, sure. We bought the railroad. That was a socialistic program, of course. But yeah, I think Harvey. What a great disappointment that Harvey never became an elected governor. Harvey would have been a great guy, and governor.
Yeah. Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976. What sort of relationship did the Farmers Union have with the Carter administration? Was it as close as it had been with Johnson and Kennedy?
Yeah, it was. Jimmy Carter came to South Dakota to campaign. I think we were down in Beersford in South Sioux Falls, and he had big gathering of rural people. And we went down and I met Jimmy Carter at the airport. Farmers Union were his hosts there. Mm-hmm. And we met him at the airport, and I rode in the same car with him to the speaking event. And he told me that his farm policy, he would be depending on the Farmers Union to give him directions on the farm policy. And up to a point, that was true. But, well, let's see. Chuck, who did Jimmy Carter appoint Secretary of Agriculture? Bob Berglund, right.
And congressman from the North District up in Northwest.
And I want to complete my comments about Jimmy Carter and his attitude toward agriculture. I knew Berglund when he was from Minnesota, was a congressman. And I visited with Bob one day in his office in Washington, and Bob had just hired an assistant, a top assistant in the Department of Agriculture, a guy that came from California that didn't know much about family farms. And I said, Bob, why'd you hire a guy like that? Well, he said, Ben, I didn't really have any choice. Somebody higher up on the scale than I am decides who will be my assistant. So I take it from that somehow that the Jimmy Carter and even the Secretary of Agriculture didn't always get what they wanted in the way of putting together programs for farmers.
Yeah. Do you think sometimes farmers have overestimated the importance of the Secretary of Agriculture in establishing farm policy? Does he not mostly do what the president wants him to do?
Absolutely, he does. We try to have something to do about the appointment of the Secretary of Agriculture, but obviously he reflects what some of the powers.
A little bit in the president's ear that way.
Yeah, well, that's about it. But he sure doesn't get what he would want. Secretaries seldom get really what they want. Yeah. Charlie Brannan didn't,
Vice President Mondale, did he have any? Was he of any help for Farmers Union during those years?
Oh yeah, Mondale from Minnesota. And Minnesota is a strong farmers union. Mondale was very close to the Minnesota Farmers Union, as he was to the National Farmers Union. And we a lot of us knew Mondale personally because he'd been around a lot. And we were really, I was at least disappointed that he didn't do any better in the presidential campaign than he did. Mm-hmm. Of course, he was running against Ronald Reagan. I mean, what can you say?
In 1978, I think it was, we had the advent of the American agriculture movement, and they had the tractor came to Washington. Yeah. Going all the way back to the origins of Farmers Union, there were holding actions and farm strikes, and there was the farm holiday during the 1930s. Why do you feel it's been so difficult for farmers to discover that kind of action doesn't ultimately work?
Well, I don't know. You're right. The farmers went through that in the old days. They stopped auctions and began the co-ops and tried to be more militant. But farmers are individuals. They're
difficult for them to decide not to plant crops or not to harvest them.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's pretty hard to say, well, I'm not going to plant this over here because I need to hold down the volume of the product, but farmers they're a difficult bunch to. Well, I shouldn't say that, but to get them organized, to get them all going in the same direction, because they are rugged individuals. They're out there on their farm and they do their own thing. They don't have any boss, and they tend to be very independent. And sometimes we're our own worst enemy because we are so independent.
Sure, and I think looking back over 25 years since that particular era, it doesn't. And I guess I'd like you to comment on that. It doesn't seem that the kind of opposition, the kind of things that angered producers about the Carter administration's farm policy were justified because things went even worse later on.
Well, that's right. Carter followed an administration that had a pretty decent farm program, and during Carter's administration, the farm program began to slip behind, and we blamed Carter for that but I'm not sure that he could do a lot more.
Mhm.
But I think that was the slippage at Carter. It happened during his administration.
Yeah. Another issue that cropped up in the late 1970s as a result of sort of the thing that's happening right now with energy was the alternative energy.
Yeah.
You want to talk at all about the early days of ethanol and gasohol?
Yeah, we called it gasohol in those days, and it was a brand new idea, and Farmers Union grabbed onto it, the national and the state, and we could see the potential there if we could just generate fuel from something we raised on the farm. And there were organizations that were started promoting ethanol, and we didn't create any. We just got on the bandwagon and went with them. And you were involved in one winter. We had conferences all around the state where we promoted ethanol. And as you know, we'd built a little ethanol maker, a little still, that we had sitting on the table in the back of the room, and it steamed and puffed away during the meeting, and we talked about ethanol and the advantages and the problems and the pitfalls. But at the end of the meeting, we generally had a few drops of alcohol in the cup. And in those days, we didn't know where we were going. There was a line of thinking that every farmer might have his own little plant out on the farm, and during the winter he would be making ethanol out of corn or weeds or grass or hay. We didn't know how. And there were people who made little machines to do that they tried to sell to farmers. And it took about 10 years or more after we started that process that we really found out that it's not going to be done on the farm. It's going to be done on a large scale, probably with a big co-op, and it had to be really refined. Some of the early ethanol that went out mixed with gasoline caused a problem because it wasn't properly refined and blended. So it was a process of learning, but Farmers Union played a major role in that. I'm really proud and pleased the role that we played in that. I think Farmers Union efforts brought ethanol along much faster than it would have gone otherwise.
Mm-hmm. You had a lot of young staff members that worked for you during the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Some longer than others. One of them ultimately becoming president of the South Dakota and then the National Farmers Union. You want to talk about some of those folks?
Well, when I came to office, it seemed that we needed some new staff people. Some were retired. Arlene Schley was here when I came. But I adopted the policy of hiring some young people who were smarter than I was. I mean, Dick and I had a successful administration because he went out and hired a lot of the smartest people he could find. And that's what I tried. I hired a lot of young people and told them what I wanted to do and let them do it. And it worked. It really worked. And, of course, Lee Swenson was one of my employees. Lee was a farm boy from Minnesota had gone to college, and he'd been in the Army, and his dad got sick, and he was brought home, and I needed a state secretary. We'd always had a woman as state secretary over the years, and it seemed that was what people expected. But there was some kind of a little rumor and stuff like that going on when you have a woman who travels all the time to conventions, and I wanted to put a stop to that. So I brought in Lee and made him secretary of the South Dakota Farmers Union, and of course Lee did a great job. And then later on, when I retired in 1981, Lee became president, and then from there he went to be president of the National Farmers Union. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Another area that's been very important for Farmers Union, of course, we talked about the relationship with cooperatives a bit. the relationship with the Farmers Union Insurance and the Service Association. You want to talk about that a little bit? I think Clifford Ott was the state manager almost throughout the time you were president.
I think that goes back to, we'd have to give Jim Patton again the credit for developing our association with insurance companies. And it was, and still is, a very good association for us. Cliff Ott, no, before Cliff Ott, there was a...
Erickson?
Yeah, Paul Erickson. Paul Erickson was the first director of Farmers Union Insurance in our state. And then when Paul retired, Cliff Ott took it over, and Cliff Ott was there for probably close to 20 years. But and then we've had ups and downs in the insurance business. We were partnered to Baldwin Piano Company for a while, and Baldwin, the whole company went into bankruptcy, and we took a real hit on that. And but we've recovered. The Farmers Union Insurance has recovered again now, and we have a good going company, and it's a real asset to the Farmers Union organization.
You were also, I think, involved in the establishment of Farmers Union Enterprises, weren't you? The kind of agency that the state organizations have for their role in Farmers Union marketing and processing?
Yes, and I don't recall just what the genesis of that was, but the byproduct from the packing plant become a very lucrative product to process and resell, and somehow we formed a cooperative to get into that business, and it grew and grew, and it's a very profitable business, and it became a real asset to the Farmers Union. We had our board members on the cooperative, and it even today it makes a major contribution, I think, to the Farmers Union budget. But it's strange how many. It's part of agriculture, and we were alert. Somebody was alert enough to get in on the ground floor and become a part of that byproduct business.
Yeah. One of your last major issues was the initiated constitutional amendment for single-member Senate districts in I think that campaign for petitions gathering at least was in 1981.
That's right.
Just last week, I think a constitutional revision commission recommended single-member House districts. Does that make you feel a little bit like a prophet or something?
Well, it dates back to 1980. We had... I don't know that Farmers Union had a position. I think we did. That it wasn't really good representation to have, for example, Minnehaha County had 4 senators, all elected at large. They could all live on the same street. Brown County had 2, I think. Rapid City, Pennington County had 2. And we felt that, we're not getting a good shake out of this. I don't know how Dr. Farber got involved in this, but somehow Dr. Farber and the Farmers Union teamed up, and he helped us draft a single-member district for the election of state senators. And so we put that together and went to Pier and authorized petitions and circulated them one summer in 1981. It took 35 or 36,000 signatures, which seemed like a tremendous job, but our folks went to work on it big time. Well, there's another organization called Acorn, which was sort of was a national group, but they dealt mostly in local issues like school boards and streets and local type of things, but they helped us a lot in circulating the petitions. So we managed to put that on the ballot, and that carried. And I can't say today how much we benefited from it, but I'm sure that we did. When you can break up a group like Minnehaha County and at least require senators to run in specified districts. Now, okay, with Doc Farber, we talked about single House member districts also, but Doc thought, well, now we've got opposition to this. Let's not buy ourselves any more problems. So we went for that, and Doc Farber's still alive. He's a great guy, and but Doc Farber was the guy that really put the meat on the bones of that of that program. So I give Doc credit.
Yeah. I suspect that I haven't had a chance to study all the arguments that were used before the revision commission in discussing that, but I suspect it probably had something to do with people maybe wanting to. Some of the rural districts have gotten really huge, and they just it's a lot of travel for representatives and candidates.
Sure. Well, then there was the one man, one vote system that went down all across the country, and we had to redistrict our representation to fit the national criteria, and that made some difference.
But now we have a couple of split districts already because of the Native American issue.
Yeah, and that's something that the legislature will have to deal with.
Yeah.
I was in New Zealand once visiting, and the New Zealand legislature, their constitution requires that the legislature be made up of ethnic group. New Zealand has their native, like we have our Indians, and the legislature requires that if they make up 10% of the population, by constitution they must have 10% of the representation in the legislature. And this is not a bad idea. I don't know how that would work here, but at least it gave recognition to the folks who were there first.
And it's hard to get away from gerrymandering as it happens to designing legislative districts.
Yeah, I spend the winter in California, and we have an example of what Tom DeLay's been able to do down there. Parts of California near the border are very, very democratic because, and so they gerrymandered, and they ran districts with little fingers down there into the south so they could control how the vote came out. But gerrymandering, there's supposed to be some laws against it. Well, the courts take a look at that every now and then, but somebody's always trying.
Tradition, being named for one of the founding fathers of the country, I think, Elbridge Gerry.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Gerrymandering,
You decided to retire in 1981. You were 65.
Yeah.
What motivated you at that point?
Well, I was getting along fine with her. I could have run for another term, maybe two more. But
you weren't mandated to retire then, because I think we had a 70-year-old retirement age.
There was 70. Yeah, the board we adopted a policy of 70 years on the board, and a couple of board members were shoved off because of that. But I'd been here 20 years, and I'd had a good time. I thought very successful 20-year administration, and I was 65, and I thought it was time for me to leave. And so I just announced that I was not leaving. I talked to several people 2 years before and said, I'm pulling out here at the end of this term, and you should be finding somebody to run. So I gave the members over a year's notice that I was leaving, and so. But that was my decision. That I just thought I'm still in good health. I want to do something, and after I retired, I did a lot of world traveling. I've been to the Orient and to Africa and Russia. I've been in a lot of places, and that was what my goal was, to retire and have fun.
And you had, of course, Lee Swenson, who we mentioned, was elected then.
Yeah.
Paul Simmons, who was a member of the board, ran against him.
Yeah, Paul is a good guy. He was quite a close race, I think. And I tried not to be partial in that because I liked them both. But Lee won, and Paul stayed on the board, I guess, and has been very supportive of Farmers Union.
They had a period when they didn't get along real well, but that was resolved over by the time that Paul retired to run for the legislature, I think in 1984, while they were getting along fine.
Yeah, I'm sure Paul was a good guy.
Yeah. So you mentioned you did a lot of traveling after that. Of course, your first wife passed away.
Yeah.
And she did get to do some traveling.
Yeah, after we retired.
You went to China, didn't you?
Yeah, we went to China and walked on the wall. Japan, we did Japan. We went to Hong Kong. One of the best trips that Dorothy and I took was to Egypt. We visited the Holy Lands, and then we spent 3-4 days there, and 3 or 4 days in Egypt. We flew out. We we flew to the dam, the Aswan Dam of the Nile River, and then took a cruise boat down. Took a couple of days to get back down to Cairo. And we would cruise. In the night, we'd, of course, sleep on the boat. But then early in the morning, while it was still cool, because it was hot there. It was maybe September. It was still hot there, the Sahara Desert type. And we'd go out and we'd visit the pyramids and all the structures of the old Egyptian kings. What do they call them in those days? Pharaohs, yeah, a bunch of pharaohs, and it was a tremendous trip. But we did, and traveling was great. And I don't know, this is off the record maybe, but we had a great Farmers Union bus trip program, and that's not off the record. Yeah. We had a great Farmers Union travel program that included.
We didn't talk about. You might mention the bus program, certainly.
Yeah, the bus program was started. Actually, our bus program, I think maybe Paul Upsall started that. It was initiated by Bill Thatcher and the big co-ops. Matter of fact, GTA lent us enough money to buy the first bus. Mm-hmm. And then to pay off the loan, we would, every time we took a busload of people to tour GTA, he'd give us like $10 or $15 per head to pay the debt, retire the debt, and I guess we paid for that bus that way. When I came on board, we had 2 buses. They were old, and Les Sabo was the bus driver, and he had an assistant called, his name was Radcliffe, Ted Radcliffe. And Les was on full-time payroll, and Ted was on part-time. And about all we did was to haul patrons to Minneapolis, to the regionals, GTA and Cynics, and then haul kids to camp. But we decided to enlarge that and get into a travel program for our members, and so we bought a new. Les Sabian and I went to North Dakota, Pembina,
yeah.
And we brought back a brand new Greyhound type bus. I think it cost $60,000. A lot of money in those days. Yeah. And then with the bus program really exploded. We went to Alaska. We went to California and Florida with those, but we bought another one too then. And I decided that our folks would like to see Mexico, so I said to Les, why don't we drive to Mexico? Oh, he wasn't sure, but we hired an interpreter. When he got to the border, somebody got on the bus with him, and we toured Mexico. He did. With that busload of people, it was a great tour. Mm-hmm. But he come back, and he was kind of a nervous wreck. He said, don't ever ask me to do that again. He said, that's no good. He said, one thing about it, every time you cross from one county to another, there's somebody, you had to bribe somebody. But he came back, and so we didn't give up Mexico. After that, we ran the bus to the border and parked the bus at some Mexican border, Texas border town. We did several trips, and then the National Farmers Union put together several international trips, and that's when I went to Russia on that. When I was still working for Farmers Union, I was involved in that trip. Mm-hmm. So travel. Well, it's okay. Anyhow, to finish up with the bus program, I wasn't president then. I'm not sure how that happened, but somehow we're out of the bus business, and I think it's unfortunate because it was a great service to our members, and it was a great PR, public relations tool for a Farmers Union to see that bus go through town. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we're out of the bus business anyhow.
Yeah. We got to talk a little bit about your family. You got 3 daughters that we talked about earlier. You've got grandchildren. You probably got great-grandchildren.
I got great-grandchildren. You bet I have.
You want to talk about them a little bit?
Well, I have 3 daughters. Our oldest daughter was born in California when I was out in California. I went to California in 1936 and stayed there till 42. And Donna was born out there. Then I came back in 42 and began farming near the farm where I grew up. I rented a farm. And we had 2 other girls. Our kids are all girls. Mm-hmm. And so we lived in a rural school district. They went to country school just like I did when I was little. until we merged country schools. Well, when I was in the legislature in 1955, one of the toughest things I had to deal with was making a decision to close down all rural schools. We passed a bill in 1955 requiring that every school district in South Dakota contain a 12-year school. And this was quite unpopular. And this is an issue I had to deal with when I ran for re-election. But I thought it needed to be done. And so we closed down all the country schools, and at that time then we merged with Tulare. And my kids went to Tulare High School, where I went to high school. The girls, they're still in South Dakota. And one lives in Frankfort, Linda's in Frankfort, Donna's down at Mount Vernon. She and her husband are retired, and they spend 2 months in the winter in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And my middle daughter Barbara works here. She graduates from Huron College, and not late, but in her 30s, and now has a nice job with South Dakota Social Services. Mm-hmm. So the kids are doing fine, and I have 6 grandchildren, 3 boys and 3 girls. And
one of them teaches college.
Yeah, one of them teaches. Debbie teaches Dickinson, yeah, and she's now working on her doctorate. She's got her master's. Mm-hmm. And so the kids are, well, yeah. And I've got several I think I got 13 great-grandchildren. And it's hard to believe that one of them is a junior in college. My great-grandson is a junior in college, Benny.
You could have a great-great-grandson.
That could happen. He's going to be 21 in June. So I think I've been very fortunate. I had a great family, and Dorothy passed away in 1987. Which is really sad. Mm-hmm. And I didn't like living alone. And I knew a lady who'd lived across the road from us when we farmed, and she had lost her husband. And in 1988, we got married, and then we've done some traveling too.
Mm-hmm. That's almost 20 years now.
Yeah, 18 years, I think. Yeah, that seemed possible. Yeah. So that was the transition there that was very difficult, but we have a good life now. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. What sort of advice would you give someone today who wanted to become active in cooperatives or farm organizations? It's certainly different out here than it was 40 or 50 years ago.
Well, I don't know. I think one thing I've seen happen over the last 30 years, the fragmentation of farm representatives. Now you go to Peer now and look at the registration lobby list, and there's corn growers, wheat growers, beekeepers. There are about 20 fragmented groups, and I think it's diluted our ability to speak for the American farmer. Yeah, yeah. And so that's I think corn growers, they need their supporters in the soybean, but they should also realize that they need a umbrella farm organization to represent them. Yeah. So your question was what?
Well, it was about what advice you would give someone. Well, this kind of leads into another area that we have to backtrack a little bit. You were involved in the founding of Ag Unity. I talked about that with J.D. Lind when I interviewed him last summer. Yeah. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, Ag Unity was Ag Unity was something that we developed out in Pierre. I think it didn't start until after I was involved. I was president when we had already had a coalition with labor out there, but we wanted to expand it and get a coalition going with all the farm groups. And in those days, there were only half a dozen farm organizations, and we brought them all together, and we elected as chairman of that group Lind. What's his first name? J.D. Lind.
From Kansas.
And from all the time that I was involved in Ag Unity, J.D. Lind was the chairman. We never elected anybody else. Yep. He was sort of a mediator between the Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union. He was, kind of a halfway guy. Yeah.
Didn't necessarily mean you agreed on everything.
No, we didn't agree on anything, and on everything, of course. But when we did agree on something, we had a pretty strong lobby to go to peer with that say, here's what the Ag Unity people want, and we had to compromise some. Mm-hmm. But I think it was a good organization. I guess it's still going.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Looking to the future, would you describe yourself as an optimist or a pessimist? Almost everybody wants to call themselves an optimist.
Well, I guess I do too.
Yeah.
I guess I do too. I've seen. I bought a farm in 1952. That's 8 miles straight east of Tuller on a paved road that goes 10 miles east before it peters out at the James River. And when I first bought that place, there were 10 farmers on that road who farmed and lived there. Now there is only one farm on that road that's still operated by the owner or the person who lives there. Yeah. And so I've seen that change, and I'm thinking, well, maybe this isn't good, but change is nothing more sure than change. And now I rent my farm to I don't know if they're incorporated or not. It's a family farm group anyhow. Yeah. And they farm 8 or 10,000 acres. They farm most of that land along that highway. And they're good guys, and they're doing the best they can. And it's we don't have any other way to be but optimistic, I guess. For pessimists, we fall behind. Yeah, we need to be optimistic to keep up with what's going on.
Yeah, you need to be pessimistic enough to recognize the problems, but optimistic enough to try to solve them.
Yeah, to know that progress is coming. Mm-hmm. Nothing more sure than change, and you need to ride the waves. You can't sit back and say, "Oh hell, that's bad." Mm-hmm. You need to ride the waves to stay up with progress. Sometimes something that's labeled progress is not really progress, so we have to sort that out. Mm-hmm. And but I think, yeah, sure, I'm optimistic here that things will get better.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any area that we didn't talk about?
Well, let's see. I don't know, Chuck. You've done a pretty good job there.
I had 117 questions, and I improvised quite a few.
I think that's probably enough.
Okay. Let me sign off here. We've been visiting with Ben Radcliffe. Thank you for participating in the Cooperative Legacy Project.
Okay, Chuck. You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Ben, would you like to talk a little bit about your family, your kids?
Well, as most of you know, I and my first wife were married in 1935. We lived in South Dakota for a while and then went to California and then came back to South Dakota. And Dorothy and I had 3 daughters. They're all living in South Dakota, fortunately. The oldest one became a graduate nurse, married a postmaster in Mount Vernon and spent most of her life there. My middle girl, Barbara, graduated from Huron College and is a state social worker. My third girl, Linda, went right to work out of high school and has worked for the state of South Dakota for most of her life. I have 6 grandchildren. Each one of my daughters have 2 children. Each have a boy and a girl. And I have 13 great-grandchildren. And as I said, we're fortunate that most of them stay here in South Dakota. Now, in 1987, Dorothy passed away, and a year later, I married Dell Fogelsong, which had been a friend of ours. And Dell has 4 children. She has a boy and 3 daughters. And those girls all live in South Dakota, too. Her son, however, is an engineer, and an engineer for Shell Oil, and he lives in Texas. So I think I've had a very fortunate life with a great family and a bunch of people that I've enjoyed and been an asset to my career.
Okay.
When I became president of the Farmers Union, the first thing I realized was that one of the great parts of Farmers Union was the youth program. And in connection with the youth program, they have camps that last from 1 day to a week. And I was invited to speak at their camps, and I went, but I found out it's a little hard to get the kids' attention. They're having fun. They got boys and girls together, and it's hard to get their attention. So I brought my guitar along, and I found if you played a couple of tunes, you get their attention. Then you can talk to them. This is one of the tunes that they especially liked. It's about a young fellow that came from New York, came to South Dakota, and he wanted to be a cowboy. This was his story. I always wished that I could be a cowboy, riding in a rope and where the wind blows free. But now I wish that I was not a cowboy. Look what's going to happen to me. I can't get off of my horse. All day and night I ride among the cattle. I can't get off of my horse, 'cause some dirty dog put glue on my saddle. Then there's another verse, someday they'll bury me out on the prairie, out among the sagebrush where the skies are blue. But when they dig that hole for me to rest in, better dig it big enough for two, 'cause I can't get off of my horse. All day and night I ride among the cattle. I can't get off of my horse, 'cause some dirty dog put glue on my saddle. On my saddle, on my saddle. Some no good ornery low down thief and sneaking through. Dirty dog put glue on my saddle. Some dirty dog put glue on my saddle. Well, I'd get their attention singing a song like that, and I wanted to talk to kids about cooperatives and about political action. A lot of people today think the government is them and not us. But I think we need to change our attitude, and this is what I talk to the kids about. We can become motivators in changing government, making things better for us, if we think of government as part of us and not part of them. So I went to a lot of camps. I was the president of the Farmers Union for 20 years, and I think I went several hundred camps of one kind or another. So it was a lot of fun.
And in my travels with South Dakota Magazine, that's the most enjoyable part. Is I constantly come across stories that illustrate that rural culture and what a wonderful thing it is. And today we were talking about entrepreneurs a lot this afternoon. And let me just tell you one of my favorite little South Dakota stories that it came to mind as we were talking about entrepreneurs. In Kingsbury County, back in the 1930s, there were two brothers, Conrad and Miles Wirtz. And maybe possibly still some Wirtz farmers out there, I'm not sure. W-E-R-T-Z. Young farmers, Conrad and Miles. Well, it got so dry in the dirty 30s that it didn't even pay to go out in the field anymore. It was just so dry, it didn't pay to even go up and disc or plant anything. And they, like so many young farmers, they didn't know what to do. But they were resourceful and they were entrepreneurs. So they finally decided they had all this machinery out in the shelter belt or the trees, and they got to looking at what was out there. They had time on their hands. And they came up with the idea that they were going to try to puff wheat and explode, wheat, puff it to make cereal and sell their own cereal. And for lack of farming, that's what they were going to do. So they came up with all this material off a thrashing machine and a steam engine and different things. And they had first they had a really small little, basically a gun that exploded the wheat. They had a pretty small gun, and it was working pretty good. You'd feed the wheat into the gun, and there'd be an explosion, and the wheat would puff out. And finally, they just kept reinventing it bigger and bigger until they had like a 6-inch gun. And they were trying to get some old gas burners that they were using on something, and as they got into that 6-inch gun, the first blast blew up the building in Bancroft. And after that slowed them up a little bit. They had a hard time finding a landlord after that. And they had a hard time finding employees. But it didn't discourage them totally. They continued. They perfected it. They got just the right amount of explosion for just the right amount of wheat. And they had like a 40-foot, this is a true story, they had like a 40-foot net that caught the wheat. And they were taking big time. They got it down right. They found a building to operate out of in Bancroft and hired some employees and went to work. And in the dirty 30s, when they couldn't do any farming, they were in the cereal business. They made these 6-ounce bags of cereal, puffed wheat. They called it New Deal puffed wheat, selling it for 12 cents a bag, and they were doing really well. So why did Kellogg's and Post overtake them? It's all about the land. These guys were farmers. And the day it rained in Kingsbury County, they shut down the gun and got out of the cereal business and went back and planted corn. You know, that was it. They were farmers. They were men of the land, and they were also entrepreneurs. But the land came first. I just think that story is so typical of life in South Dakota. We're so closely tied to the land, and in that very spirit that I paid attention to Ben Radcliffe all these years. I just think he's exemplified that. I always thought Ben Radcliffe was kind of like the Cesar Chavez of family farmers in South Dakota, almost, because I was growing up at the same time. Cesar Chavez was working for the farm workers in California, and Ben was here fighting for family farmers in South Dakota. Well, Ben was born 90 years ago in Woolsey, South Dakota. Is that right? Did they get this all right for me? Because I didn't write all this. But he learned about cooperation during the depths of the Depression. And after service with the Civilian Conservation Corps and work as a fruit picker and a gold miner in California, he returned to South Dakota, fortunately for us, and began farming in 1942. And as a Spring County farmer, he recognized that farmers had to extend their influence beyond the farm gate. You had to get involved, and he became involved in the Farmers Union, thank goodness. He became involved in local government and cooperatives. Ben served 11 years on the Spring County Electric Board. He helped organize and was president of a local credit union. He was elected to the state legislature in 1954 and served four terms in the legislature. In 1955, the Farmers Union Board was expanded, and Ben became the first chairman of District 7. He was elected vice president in 58, president, and became president in 1961. And then during 20 years as the State Farmers Union president, Ben served for, I think, 9 of those years, is that right? Served for a number of years on the National Farmers Union Executive Committee, chairman of that committee for 3 years. He was a visionary Farmers Union president. He was an aggressive voice for the family farmer, fighting hard to just give them a fair shake. I was just becoming politically aware during his 10 years, I said, and he's always been mild-mannered and gentlemanly. I covered him as a young journalist in the 1970s, always mild-mannered, but always strong opinions and a tough fighter for the family farmer. You sense that firmness of purpose in Ben Radcliffe whenever you were around him. We lost a lot of farmers in South Dakota, but a lot of farmers and a lot of families are still on the land because of people like him. He's also good for Farmers Union, and for Farmers Union's future, he gave us strong support. And again, I think very visionary. He gave support to Farmers Union education programs and summer camps. I think he even used to play his guitar and sing some of the summer camps. Is that right? Sure did. We tried to talk him into singing tonight, but he passed on the opportunity. He also led the way in establishing a Farmers Union scholarship program in 1961. So you can see why there is a Ben Radcliffe Day. Ben retired in 1981, and he was bestowed the honor of President Emeritus, the only Farmers Union president to receive that honor. Today, Ben and his wife Dale are retired and live in Huron, and Ben is just as active today, I think, as he's been. He's a fine man, a heart of gold, a man who loves his country and his land and his home state of South Dakota. So on Ben Radcliffe Day, it's an honor for me to introduce Ben Radcliffe.
Thank you, Bernie, for that wonderful introduction. Before Larry has to leave, I want to be sure and tell all of you and to tell Larry how much we appreciated Senator Larry being here today. And we were visiting a while ago and about the fact that Dell and I spend about 5 months out of the year in Texas. And Larry asked me what we thought about the Mexican problem we have all over the country now, 11 million undocumented Mexicans. And I said, well, you know, down there in the valley where we live, just 7 miles from Mexico, 90% at least of the residents in that valley are Mexicans. And they're just mighty fine people. We like the Mexicans. And I have to believe that the only way to deal with this problem is to somehow figure a way to make these 11 million Mexicans citizens. Put our arms around them, make them citizens. They came up here to get a good job. I think many of us would do the same thing if we were down there. We'd be up here looking for something better. So Larry, I think we kind of agree on that. Well, Dell and I do spend 5 months down there in Texas, and we live in a town called Weslaco. And it's situated about halfway between McAllen and Brownsville, in there somewhere. It's near Mission. And it's in a retirement court. We own a nice mobile home. That's 2 baths and 2 bedrooms, so you can come down and visit us. And we just think it's a great place to spend the winter. Now it's getting pretty crowded. The valley, everybody knows what the valley is. The valley runs from Brownsville upstream the Rio Grande River for about 60 miles. And after that it becomes rough country and nobody lives there. And it's about 30 miles wide, the valley is, on our side of the river. And about 1 million people live in that little piece of land there. And in the winter, there are somewhere between 150 and 200,000 snowbirds down there. 200,000 of us come down there. And we bring a lot of money down there. And that is kind of their harvest, is when the snowbirds come down there. As a matter of fact, the place that Dell gets her hair fixed, when the snowbirds all go home, they shut the place down. And so they really do depend on us for being down there. So, yeah, come down and see us. I'm not sure how many more years we'll be going because somebody has indicated here that I'm getting old. Okay, well, I want to say, where's Julie? Julie? Oh, there she is. I think Julie, she did a good job putting this all together, didn't she? Let's give her a hand. But in fact, Julie has done this before. Julie is a lady senator from Burke, South Dakota. When she's not working in the Senate, she's working for the Farmers Union or helping her husband with a trucking business or whatever. Anyhow, last fall, Julie put on a golfing contest to raise money for the foundation. And I guess it went pretty well, Julie. I was invited down there, but I had some problem with one of my eyes, and I had some deterioration of the retina, and I was seeing double. So when I went to play on the golf course, I didn't know which ball to hit. That's how stupid it was. And that, that's a fact, that's not funny. But I understand that the young guys back in the office, Julie, but the reason that I didn't go golfing was because at my age, I didn't want to get that close to a hole in the ground. Well, I want to say something about Senator McGovern. He's a great guy, a war hero, and represents the spirit of South Dakota as I've known it all of my years. I first met George, I think in 1953, although I've been in George's history a while ago, so he didn't become active in the Democratic politics until 55, but I think I met George in 53. And that was following the 1952 election, the big Eisenhower landslide. Who voted in 1952? Anyhow, I like Ike was the slogan, and everybody in the country, including South Dakota, voted for Ike. In fact, in the South Dakota legislature in 1953, following that election, there were only 2 Democrats, George, and they were both from Charles Mix County, where Republicans didn't run because they couldn't win. So the 2 Democrats. So that's when McGovern showed up on the scene, decided this just won't do. And partly because of George's influence, I decided to run. And in 1954, I was elected. And as Bernie said, I served for 4 terms, 8 years. And Joe Foss was governor. Ralph Herseth was in the Senate. He went on to be governor. And McGovern worked with us at the session. And in 1956, he ran for a Washington office, and that the rest is history. But Joe Foss, he was a war hero. He was a great guy, but he wasn't a great governor, I didn't think. But he was a fun guy to party with, you know? But then they say Bernie's a fun guy to party with too, but he come up sometime and we'll party. But I want to tell you how important it is to have somebody in Washington, D.C. who can help you out when you have a problem. And that goes back to when I was president of the Farmers Union in the 1970s. The story begins when Tony Deschamps put together a group of co-op people and farmers to take a trip to the Soviet Union to look at their farming there, and it was a nice trip. And he called on me to coordinate that trip because South Dakota had some success in and running travel programs. And so Tony asked me to do that. So we put out the word, and Frank Butler and Cy Carpenter, you recognize those names, and some other people from the co-ops came, and we ended up with a group of 17. Well, one of them was what turned out to be Edith Willey from Frankfurt. Who knows Edith Willey? Yes. And Edith Willey, well, we didn't call her Edith. I mean, you called her Mrs. Willey. You just didn't call her Edith at all because she was Mrs. Willey, right, Arlene?
Right.
And she had done a lot for the Farmers Union. As a matter of fact, her nephew is the artist who painted the mural in the Farmers Union auditorium on the north side. Any of you who haven't seen that, you should stop by. It's sort of a history of the prairie land of South Dakota right up to the modern times. Anyhow, Mrs. Willey decided to go. And so when there were 17 of us, we had to fly out of Sioux Falls. We got down there and about time for the flight to go out, an hour or so, and I said, let's take a look at our tickets and passports, see if we're all set. So everybody shelled out their passports and tickets, and Mrs. Willey was having a problem. And she looked through her purse and she couldn't find it. And she said, "Oh, I can't find my passport." Then all at once she said, "Oh, I know where it is." I thought, "That's fine, let's get it and get going." But it's back home in Frankfurt on the piano. My passport's back there. So I didn't know what to do. So I had an idea. I didn't have cell phones in those days, so I went to the wall and phoned it, and I called Senator McGovern's office in Washington. I don't know who answered the phone. George Cunningham, maybe. He was my favorite guy in your office. George had a great staff. Anyhow, I said to Cunningham, I've got a big problem here. I got this lady who wants to go to Russia with us. She doesn't have a passport. Shall I send her home? He said, "No, bring her along. We'll meet the plane in New York, flying to JFK, and see, they're in Washington, that's the ways." And so we took off, and we got to New York about 5 in the afternoon, and we had a layover until 11. But as soon as we arrived at the hotel, or at the airport, here was one of McGovern's people, and they put Mrs. Willey in a cab, and 2 hours later she came back with a passport, temporary passport, just like that. So it's fun to have somebody, nice to have somebody in Washington, but that's not the end of the story. We flew from JFK to Amsterdam, and in Amsterdam we changed planes. We went and got onto a Russian plane, Aeroflot I think they called it. There were still 17 of us, Mrs. Willey was along. And we got on this Aeroflot and we flew to Warsaw, Poland. And I was still pretty communist in those days. And we came down and they deplaned us and put us in a little room while they refueled or whatever they were going to do. And when it got time to get back on, we started to load again, and they had given us a big boarding pass. It was about 2x4 piece of wood with a number on it. We got ready to board again, and I'm sitting there, and everybody's on but Mrs. Willey and me. And Mrs. Willey could not find her boarding pass. And she said, "Then I looked through that purse. It was not there, and I looked and I couldn't find it." And that big Russian guard said, "You're not leaving here until I see that passport." I didn't want to stay there. So finally he took that purse, a big purse. He held it up like that and dumped all the contents on the table. Man, you should have seen what came out of that purse. I mean, you guys, have you ever really looked at your wives' purses? I mean, there's something to behold. All the stuff that those women put in their purses. And she had a big one, and it was filled. All kinds of gadgets and even some food. So, but anyhow, Mrs. Willey and I got on the airplane and we went to Moscow. We're flying into Moscow, we circled the airport, it's still daylight, and I could see all around the perimeter of the airport were Russian fighter planes. They were behind a pile of dirt, a little berm they call it. They were behind a little pile of dirt, but all around there. And that was part of their system of protecting their country, so we felt pretty protected when we got there. We went to the hotel. As we were registering, they asked for our passports. They took our passports, and we didn't get them back until we left Russia. Now that disturbed a lot of people. Frank Butler was pretty unhappy. They raised quite a lot of fuss, but no way we're keeping your passport until you leave the country. We went upstairs to the 5th room, and a big Russian lady behind a desk gave us our hotel key. When we left the hotel, she took the key. So we're out on the streets of Moscow without a passport, without a key. But we had a pretty good tour leader, so we were doing all right. One of the things that they did on that trip that I thought was really neat, one night they loaded us, anybody who wanted to go onto a bus, and they went to, I think it was the Lenin Library, which is a pretty prestigious place in Moscow. And there was a big room there, and there were a couple of, I think they were professors, and they were ready to conduct a no-holds-barred discussion on the communist type of government, the socialist government. And they were the defenders, and we were to challenge them. And there were some college kids along. And it was really quite an open debate. It got even a little bit hot and loud, but that was what they were there for, to defend their socialistic government. I didn't say very much because I didn't want to get locked up. I hadn't get Miss Willie home yet, So I kind of went along with it, but it was a wonderful experience. They did take us to a collective farm. The last venture was to a collective farm, and it was a dairy farm. It was a busload of us, and we got there, and we got out, and we were welcomed, and then the superintendent of the dairy plant came out, and he's all dressed in a long white coat, and he had his workers bring out their bulls, their animals. Big, huge Holstein bull. Probably the best bull I'd ever seen. And so we were looking at that, and then we looked at the dairy barns, and nobody working around there in the dairy barns but the women. They were all dressed, with their little dairymaid suits on, and the barn was clean, and the straw was fresh, and just women working there. So I asked, where are the men? Well, it's harvest time, and they're out harvesting now, but I saw a bunch of them over here under a shade tree. And he said, well, one of the combines broke down, and they can't just drive 10 miles to the John Deere store or the International store and get a part. They have to send acquisition papers to some central point, and if they approve of, after a while, they get a part back. So these guys are sitting in the shade, drinking lemonade, and I got to thinking, hey, here the women are working, the men are sitting in the shade, drinking lemonade. Maybe their system is not so bad after all. But anyhow, we got Miss Willie home, George. I think you'd be glad to hear that. Okay. Well, let's see. I want to talk to you about a couple of other things here. Last year, up in Aberdeen, I had the same opportunity to visit with some of you. And we talked about some of the achievements of the Farmers Union, how the Farmers Union had developed a wonderful youth program that teaches cooperative business and political action and a lot of other good things. And we talked about the fact that we had a great legislative program, helped build the railroads when the railroads were about to be abandoned in 1980. We worked with Bill Janko, who was governor then, and got the railroad built. We played a major role in bringing about ethanol. We were way out front with that. And one of the things I want to talk about tonight a little bit is something that I didn't talk about up there, that's maybe just as important as building a railroad. Before 1982, the legislature, all of the legislators were elected at large within their district. And some of the districts were large. And for example, Minnehaha County, I think at that time, was electing 4 senators and 7 or 8 House members. They all lived in the same district. They could all live on the same block. And we didn't think this was really the right kind of elective system that was the best, especially for the rural people. And about that time, Dr. Farber from the university over here was heading up a committee on changing the Constitution of South Dakota, and he had the idea that we should develop single Senate districts. And so he came down and talked to us, and we decided to put that issue on the ballot. And so he helped us draft that, we put it on the ballot, and Farmers Union did that virtually alone. We had a little help from an organization called Acorn, which some of you have heard of. But that took 36,000 signatures, and we put that on the ballot. And that became the law of the land now. And I hope at least, rural people get a better representation now in Pierre, because every senator now had his own district. They have to be separated from their fellow senators. And now I think in Pierre they're talking about another amendment to provide for a single House member district. And they won't do it. We'll have to do it if it gets done. One of the things that I remember when I first went to the legislature, or when I was farming, there were only a couple of farm organizations. There was the Farmers Union, the Farm Bureau, and along came NFO after a while. The Grange is pretty well gone. And so when we were out in Pierre, we had a couple of farm organizations lobby. We had the lobbyists there. And now, you go to Pierre, there are probably 20 farm organizations registered. There are the corn growers, the soybean growers, the cotton, no, not cotton, the sunflower growers, but I could go on, and beekeepers. And I think that kind of representation by the farmers have sort of diluted our influence, our impact on the legislature. And I think it'd be much better if somehow we were able to, I don't blame them for wanting to belong to corn growers, that's fine, but they really should belong to a regular farm organization, some kind of an umbrella group that would give them better representation. So I'm kind of plugging for that. Then I want to close my comments here by saying that I have come up with a motto for the Farmers Union, a good motto that relates to too many farm organizations. Now, if I can remember how it goes, it's based on something that Abraham Lincoln is alleged to have said, that part about you can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time. Remember that? The motto is, there's some organizations that represent some of the farmers all the time. There's some organizations that represent all of the farmers some of the time. Only one organization represents all the farmers all the time, that's Farmers Union. There you go. Thank you.
People have to get George McGovern to go twist his arm and run for legislature again, right? So, yeah, Del wouldn't mind wintering in Pierre, would you? And I really like what you had to say about the border immigration issue that's going on right now. It reminded me of another one of my favorite South Dakota stories. You know, if you give people a chance to assimilate and get along and make their way in society, they will, won't they? Great story, and I'm reminded of it because we have some of the Frericks here from Roberts County. This happened in Roberts County way back, probably 80, 90 years ago. There was a young Indian boy growing up in a Dakota-speaking home. He grew up, his parents were speaking the Indian language, so he didn't even grow up learning English. And yet he grew up with that love of the land that we've, again, talked about today. And he loved the land. He saw these people farming. His parents didn't farm, but he saw this farming going on. And he thought, boy, I'd like to be a farmer. And he was smart enough to know that the first thing you better do is learn English. So when he got into school, unlike some of the Indian kids, he really worked hard at learning English. He knew that was going to be the key to being a farmer. When he got through school, had that English down pat, found himself a little piece of land to rent in Roberts County, and thought he was a farmer. So he thought the next thing I need to do, he didn't call it this, but he needed a network, you know, what we'd call today network. He needed to figure out what this is all about, you know, meet his neighbors. And of course, where you meet your neighbors in the farming community is the country club, the grain elevator, right? So he thought, I better go hang out at the grain elevator, get to know the neighbors, ask them how, you know, when to plant the corn and all this stuff. So, first day at the grain elevator, he walks in, he sits down, and he knew they were gathered there at the cotton at the table. He sits down, and lo and behold, and he spent all them years learning English, and they're speaking Norwegian. And he didn't know, you know, he didn't know if they were snubbing him or what was going on. He just didn't know. So he went back home and thought about it for a while, and then he went and befriended his nearest neighbor, who had been at the table, and he explained to him, and the neighbor assured him, you know, he said, no, we were just insensitive. we're stupid of us. He said, and so they cooked up this little scheme. And they, Ben Rifle told me the story in the 1980s. That Ben Rifle, some of you know, I'm sure, Ben and George knew Ben, obviously knew Ben Rifle. So they cooked up this scheme, and a few months later, they walk into the grain elevator together, sit down at the table, and the young Indian farmer, in really bad Norwegian, tells this story. He said, I always wanted to be a farmer. I have this little piece of land. I don't know much about farming. I'll do whatever. If any of you guys need help, you just call me. I'll help you. And could I ask you a few questions now and then? And everybody was just charmed by Johnny Cloud was his name. Charmed by him. And that was the day they quit speaking Norwegian in that little town, at least in the grain elevator. They went back to English because they figured Johnny couldn't speak Norwegian good enough. And now I tell this story, and my wife oftentimes has told me she thinks it's too good to be a true story, right? Well, I told it a couple weeks ago at the Dakota History Conference at Augustana College in Sioux Falls, and Wayne Knutson, who grew up, Wayne Knutson, Dean of Fine Arts at USD for many years, came up afterwards and said, oh, that was Johnny Cloud. He said, I knew him. He said he was this big, tall Indian guy, and he loved to go around and greet everybody in really bad Norwegian. Wayne knows him very well. So then when I had the name, I called the Clouds out of the phone book, insisted in my second phone call, I came across James Cloud, his grandson, who says, yes, that's exactly the family story. And in fact, he says he could see the barn from his window as we talked on the phone. So I think it's a story we haven't had in the magazine because I never had the name, but now that we have the facts, we'll write it up for the magazine. But I think it's so typical, again, of rural life in South Dakota. And another protector of that life is with us tonight, George McGovern. I saw George walk in, and I thought, boy, he looks better than ever. We should recruit him to run for something this year. It's wonderful to see you, George. I thought he's probably ready for a comeback, and then I thought, George McGovern doesn't need to make a comeback, does he? He's never lost. He never lost faith, never quit the fight, never gave up on South Dakota or on America. He's still swinging away. He's speaking, writing books, one after another, working hard, and he's here with us tonight. George was born just down the road south of here in Avon, South Dakota, son of a minister. He moved up here. He moved up here in 1928, 78 years ago, if I did my math right. And graduated from Mitchell High School, got a scholarship here at Dakota Wesleyan in Mitchell, where he enrolled in 1940, where he met Eleanor. They were married here in 1943. That's 63 years by my count, is that right? So all 5 of their children were born here, so Mitchell's very dear to George and Eleanor's heart. The rest of the story hardly needs to be told. Ben talked about it a little bit. George McGovern flew 35 combat missions as a B-24 bomber pilot in Europe, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. After the war, he returned here to this campus where he finished a degree, and then a couple years later became a professor of history and political science. He left the university in 1955, as Ben said, to revitalize the Democratic Party. He thought South Dakota needed a 2-party system. He was elected to Congress in 56, and there he began a career as an advocate for the family farmer, for the American farmer, and he represented the nation's heartland with a passion and professionalism that I don't think could ever be forgotten. President Kennedy named him the first director of the Food for Peace program. He oversaw the donation of millions of tons of food to developing nations. South Dakotans were smart enough to elect him to the Senate in 62 and again in 68 and 74. As a member of the Senate Committees on Ag, Nutrition, Forestry, and Foreign Relations and the Joint Economic Committee, he led the way in expanding those key nutrition programs. In 1972, of course, Senator McGovern was the Democratic nominee for president, the only South Dakotan so honored by any major political party. And then listen to this, since then 4 presidents have put him to work. In 1976, Gerald Ford named him United Nations delegate to the General Assembly. In 78, Jimmy Carter named him a United Nations delegate for the Special Session on Disarmament. And he served as the president of the Middle East Policy Council from 91 to 98. At that time, President Clinton appointed him ambassador to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. And the Bush administration appointed him the first United Nations Global Ambassador on Hunger. So in those positions, George McGovern has continued to 50 years of leadership in the battle against hunger. And these days, he's continuing. He's promoting now a global school lunch program that would provide meals for 300 million youngsters a day who now do not get any food during the school day, as well as another 150 million preschoolers. He told our magazine a couple years ago that parents will be sure their kids go to school for food. And he said once they're in school, they'll get an education. and education is the real weapon against poverty. According to the old bomber pilot, George McGovern says the cost would be about one B-2 bomber, according to George McGovern. He's a war hero, a teacher, a congressman, a senator, an ambassador. He should have been president. A wonderful husband for 63 years, our good friend in Mitchell in South Dakota, one of the great leaders on the American scene, George McGovern. Please welcome him.
Bernie, for that really warm, wonderful introduction. Bernie, as everyone here knows, is the editor of South Dakota magazine, which I read avidly every time an issue arrives. He said I should have been president, he should have been governor. Make that effort. I was late today, Ben, because David Crimes, who's a longtime friend of yours and also a friend of mine, prevailed on me to stop in Sioux Falls and make what was supposed to be a brief appearance before an association of people who collect political campaign paraphernalia, buttons, posters, pamphlets, billboards. There were people there from a dozen states, to my surprise, and they had probably as many tables like this in the hotel where we met in Sioux Falls as we have here tonight. Every one of them was covered with carefully arranged buttons. So it was a little hard to get away. Everybody wanted a picture or an autograph or literature that I had, and so it took a little longer, but I'm glad that I finally arrived in time to hear that. Larry, I'm sorry I didn't get to hear you. I used to listen to you in the United States Senate, but it's good to see you again. It's interesting about South Dakota politics. It's been referred to. You were right the first time, Ben. I started organizing the Democratic Party in South Dakota in 1953. In 1955, I resigned from that job to run for the United States Congress. If you weren't around at that time, right after the great landslide win by President Eisenhower, incidentally a man whom I greatly admired and still do, but I was for Stevenson in that campaign, and I came as close to being a coordinator for the Stevenson campaign in the state as anyone, and it caught the attention of Ward Clark, a young lawyer from Canastota, who was the Democratic state chairman. And he met me in that campaign. I was speaking at Platt in the high school gymnasium, I think on the Halloween night before the election. That happens to be the wedding anniversary for Eleanor and May. It was the only day I could get off from the Air Force. So I should have been home celebrating my anniversary with Eleanor instead of making a speech in Platt. But that evening led to my entering politics. Ward was there to, I guess, to sample me and to judge how I handled audiences. And late that night, sitting in Boone's Cafe in Platt, he said, "You know, George, we're going to get the hell beat out of us on Tuesday in this election. You know that, don't you?" I said, "No, I don't think so, Ward. I mean, I hear a lot of favorable comments, and I think we're going to do very well." Well, that was an indication of my naivete, because this state went overwhelmingly for President Eisenhower. And as Ben said, after that particular election, out of a legislature of 110 people, Is it still 110, Julie?
105.
How much?
105.
105. Well, it used to be 110. I think there were 75 senators and 35 House members. So the score at that time was 108-2. We had a two-party system, but that was about the ratio that most South Dakotans thought desirable. So under those circumstances, I gave up a good job here at Wesleyan, Bob. Your predecessor at that time was Matthew Smith, wonderful man, Matthew D. Smith. His son was my debate partner, both in Mitchell High School and also here at Wesleyan, and set out to organize a Democratic Party. I remember that Ward had a list of the supposedly Democratic county chairmen in the 60-some counties in South Dakota. And so I wrote each one of them a personal letter introducing myself and telling them what I hoped to do in building a two-party system in South Dakota. When I talked to Democrats, I said I'm going to build a Democratic Party. But when I talked to Republicans, I said I'm going to build a two-party system in South Dakota. I thought that would go down better, and I would argue in speaking to Rotarians and Kiwanians and various bipartisan groups that it would be good even for the Republicans if we had a competitive two-party system, and some of them bought that idea. But one of the first groups that I contacted was the Farmers Union. At that time, Ben, the headquarters was here in Mitchell. Paul Upsall was the president. Emil Lorix was the secretary of treasurer, and their office was in the old Western building down on Main Street. The Democrats had no money, so a compassionate insurance man here in town, Harold Grant, who had some connection to the college. He was the director of the 147th Field Artillery Band, but he was also the director of the Dakota Wesleyan Band. And he told me he had an extra room and I could use that for my political headquarters. It was a room about the size of that grand piano over there, I think. In any event, we started off in that same building, as I said, with the leaders of the Farmers Union. And one of the joys of my life in all these years of politics is the associations I've had with the members of the Farmers Union of this state. Ben's absolutely right. That's an organization, especially in his time and under his leadership, when they tried to speak for every farmer and rancher in the state. And they gave me an education on agriculture that has been a treasure in my life during all those years I was in politics. I was asked today about, speaking to the people who are collecting campaign buttons, about 72, and they wanted to know some of the more interesting campaign pieces I had encountered going into all 50 states when I was running for office. And one came to mind that I'm not sure I can really tell you about here in a Methodist college, but I pulled into Carbondale, Illinois one night in a jet aircraft at the end of a long day. Carbondale happens to be the home of what was then called the Southern Illinois Normal University, SINU. I was based there for 4 months during World War II. They didn't know what to do with people who volunteered to be pilots because they didn't have enough instructors, they didn't have enough airplanes, they didn't have enough airfields. I volunteered right after Pearl Harbor, 10 of us here in Wesleyan. And so they sent us all back to college for several months, and I was sent to this school in Southern Illinois, which is now the University of Southern Illinois. But as the plane pulled up to this crowd, a large crowd, out there about 9 o'clock at night, there must have been, I don't think I'm exaggerating, 8,000 or 10,000 people standing at that airport waiting for us to come in. And they had a truck, a flatbed truck, which I hopped up on, the PA system. As I looked out, there was a young woman, a young student, I think she must have been a freshman, about as close as to where you're sitting. She was dressed in a little white dress. She looked like an angel, one of the innocent, beautiful face, and she was holding a sign right under her chin, and I couldn't quite see it, so I took my glasses out, and I was just kind of curious, and I peered at that sign, and it said, "Vote for McGovern, not an asshole." I give you that for whatever it's worth. Anyway, some reporter picked that up and got into the Chicago Tribune and 2 or 3 other papers around the country. 10 years later, long after that campaign was over, I met that young woman on the streets of Chicago, if you could believe that. She recognized me and recalled that day. She said she was always proud that she was the only student on campus that made the Chicago Tribune. I'll give you that for whatever it's worth. Ben, how do you get to be 90 years old and look so young?
You're gonna be right.
Is that it? And all that hair? And you sound as strong as ever. Your mind is as sharp as it's always been. I think it's wonderful. I've said before that at earlier times in my life, when the subject of aging would come up, I always tried to sound wise by saying it's not how many years you have, it's what you do with the years that you have, rather than how many you have. But I don't say that anymore. And now that I'm 83, I want to live to be 100. And the reason is there's still so much left to be done. Bernie mentioned one of those things that we emphasize here at Dakota Wesleyan. And I say we because I still think this college is a very important part of my life. We're extremely proud of this new library that's going up over here. It's going to be one of the most beautiful buildings in the state, and it'll be a state-of-the-art library. It also will contain a public service center for students that are interested in going into the civil service or the foreign service or the United Nations or some other form of service. That's always been a strong emphasis at this college, inspiring youngsters to go into public service. I had a high school teacher by the name of Bob Pearson. He was marvelous, just wonderful. He taught American history, and he coached the high school debate squad. And one day, when I was a junior, near the end of the year, a student asked him, "Mr. Pearson, what do you think is the secret to a satisfying and happy life?" And Bob Pearson, whose every word we hung on in that class, said, "Well, for me, I think the most important thing is to be in service to other human beings. No matter what your profession is, if you can find a way of applying it so that you help other people, you're going to get great satisfaction out of that." And I think that's true, and that's the emphasis we're going to place on this new project, as some of you may have noticed on the way in. We're going to continue to place a heavy emphasis on the hunger problem. That's not the only problem of the world. It's probably part of a larger problem, which is poverty. But it's a very important problem. If you think that's not close to the top of the list of what's important for about 2/3 of the people around the world, just go without eating the kind of meal we had here tonight. Live on a little bowl of gruel once a day, or a bowl of rice, something like that. Maybe if you're lucky, you get a little milk from time to time. It's very hard to find sanitary water in many parts of the world. So there's great malnutrition across the world. And if you were to live on that kind of diet for 30 days, and then you were asked, what's the most urgent problem that you'd face? Hunger might come out on top. So that's something that's very closely related to what Ben Radcliffe has been doing all of his life, which is trying to reward the people that produce our food, try to strengthen an industry that has made us the envy of the world, and that is the efficient production of good, nutritious food. Jack Kennedy told us down here at the Corn Palace in 1960 when he was running for president. He walked out on the stage, and I take a little credit for this because he had spoken to the National Corn Picking Contest in Sioux Falls earlier that day. The wind was blowing. He had a manuscript that some aide had written for him, and it was kind of a rainfall. It was a cold, chilly day, and he didn't know much about agriculture, just to be blunt. He laid an egg. So while we're flying over here to Mitchell, he said, George, that was wonderful. What am I going to do when I get to Mitchell? I said, well, the first thing you should do, Jack, is throw away that speech. It's no good anyway. Just walk out there and tell those farmers and the townspeople and others who are there that you believe the farmers of South Dakota and of America can do more for peace and freedom in the world than any other group of Americans if we just remember that food is strength, food is health, food is hope. Food can help lay the basis for a more orderly and peaceful world. He did that day and announced that if he were elected president, he was going to create a new office in the White House called Food for Peace and appoint a full-time director to use our farm surpluses, our farm abundance, to reduce hunger in the world. And that's how I became the first Food for Peace director. I demonstrated that year in which I lost my first Senate race by less than 1%, that sometimes good things can happen to you after you've had a setback or a disappointment. I think I've learned more about the disappointments and the defeats, the sorrows that I have from some of the great victories, and I think that's one of the interesting things about life. So Ben, you've been on the right track all your life and working to make these farmers prosperous and to reward them for their labor and their efforts. It's not easy being a farmer. It's hard work, and they deserve to be well rewarded. And the thing that is the passion in my life right now is this matter that has been mentioned here earlier. I would like to see every one of the 300 million school-age kids around the world who now get nothing to eat during the school day. They trudge off to school in the morning, walk a mile or two to the village school, and then sit there for 5 or 6 hours supposedly learning on an empty stomach. So enlisting Bob Dole in the cause to give it a bipartisan front, I'm determined, if we both get enough years, that we're going to provide a good, nutritious lunch every day for every one of those 300 million hungry kids. We're reaching 20 million so far. That's just a beginning. But we've got pilot programs going in 38 countries. And one thing about school lunches, if you ever get a program started, no local politician will ever dare let it die. If you want to be defeated in any congressional district in the United States, just announce that if you're elected, you're going to kill the federal school lunch program. It's popular with parents, it's popular with doctors and nurses, it's popular with the students. They perform better. They even cut the birth rate. If a school lunch program pulls them into school, as it does wherever you start one, those little girls that don't go to school have an average of 6 children for each one of these little illiterate girls. They start getting married when they're 10, 11, 12, 13 years of age and have an average of 6 children before they're 20 years of age. The ones that are pulled into school by the promise of a decent meal, and that's the best magnet anybody has found to pull hungry kids into the schoolroom. You cut the birth rate in half. They delay marriage for 4 or 5 or 6 years. They have a better sense of what life is all about and what some of the alternatives. What's the alternative for a little girl at home with a cluster of children who can't write her name, who can't read a sentence? It's a pretty dismal opportunity, or lack of opportunity. So this is a program that I think ought to have the support of everyone, and I'm counting on the people in this room and visionary people like Ben to continue working for this special cause. Thanks so much for coming out to honor Ben tonight, and Ben, all the best to you and Dell in years ahead.
What a treat it's been for us to hear from Ben and George tonight. A lot's been said about farmers. A lot has been said about farmers union tonight, and I'm sure those of you who have been in the legislature, and there are several here who have been, would agree with what I'm going to say. But I think it's really important to say this. I spent 6 years in Pierre, and there are a lot of organizations out there. In fact, there are more registered. I think there are like 5 registered lobbyists for every legislator out there. When I was out there, there were like 500 or 600 lobbyists for the 105 legislators, and lots of organizations they represent. But most of those organizations have a really narrow focus. Even the ag groups, the corn growers are very focused on corn, and the cattlemen are very focused on cattle, and the Chamber of Commerce is very focused on keeping taxes every year. That's all fine. But the Farmers Union was the one organization, and I can't think of another one that I can say this about. The Farmers Union was the one organization that really was looking out in a wide spectrum for the benefit of all South Dakota, rural and urban, I believe. So I really respected that organization and their leaders then and now. It's a fine group, and anything they ask me to do, that's why I'm here tonight. And there's a fine Farmers Union lady and leader from Aberdeen I also want to introduce. I should have introduced earlier. Arlene Elliott and her husband Wes are here. Arlene was the winner of the, I want to read this correctly now, the Minnie Lovinger Award, was it 2 years ago? Arlene?
This is last year.
Just last year, Arlene. Please put your hand. Arlene started off with Aberdeen, came all the way down to Aberdeen. At this point, I'm going to turn this program over to two of our favorite ladies, State Senator and Farmers Union Foundation Executive Director Julie Bartling and Bonnie Geyer, the Farmers Union Education Director. They're going to award the mini Lovinger Awards for this year. Bonnie and Julie are... Julie is on her way. So. There they are, Bonnie and Julie.
Tonight we have the honor as the education program, which is a huge part of our foundation, to honor a very special lady. Farmers Union has been in this wonderful lady's blood for over 51 years. She serves as the Corson County President, and more importantly to us, though, she has served as the District 5 and Corson County Education Director since 1959. So she has held these positions for the last 47 years and continues to be a huge part of our education program, playing a very active role in the camps that we put on each year. And as you will see when she comes up here, there's a sparkle in her eye, and we know that's from her children, Altalee, Robert John, and Gary, and Altalee and her husband are here from Minnesota, so we welcome them as well. But Grace shares this with the kids at the camps too, and that's what's really important to us. She works so diligently at helping these young people understand the roles that Farmers Union plays in the cooperativeness, becoming good community leaders, and working together. And it's our pleasure tonight to present the 2006 Minnie Lovinger Esteemed Educator Award to a very dear lady and one who has a very good place in everybody's heart, Grace Bubbers.
Imagine me being speechless. When Julie called me, left a message on my answering machine that I was going to get this award, I said, no, not me. There must be somebody else that deserves it more than I do. I don't know where to start. One person that has helped me a lot get started was Arlene Schwei-Elliott. She was the state education director when I became district education director. What happened, how I got the position, I missed a meeting. Director Hines was the district education director, and my husband had gone to the meeting and he came home and he said, guess what, you got a job today. Well, it's a job that I have been very proud of and able to do. My family, of course, is very important to me. My two sons could not be with me tonight. One of them has a son that graduated this afternoon from high school, and the other one is taking the family pictures this afternoon at the graduation. So I didn't know what to do. My grandson said, oh, I'm not important. He said, go ahead and go. So here I am. Some of the people that are sitting in this room have been friends of mine for as long as, practically as long as I have worked with the Farmers Union. Ron Foster is one of the newer board members. I met Jason. I had Ben's daughters when I went to state camp. I've known them since then. and now there's grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That does tell me maybe it's time that these gray hair aren't showing for nothing. So I might just rattle on here because I'm just flabbergasted over this award. And when I started, Ben mentioned Frank Butler. Frank Butler was our district director, and he was one that was very instrumental in helping me with camps. One year he even had the county camp on his farm, and he, as you know, he was a pilot. And I think this is when Arlene was still with us. The boys slept under the airplanes in the hangar, and the girls had rooms in their house. And so that's how camping went years ago. We slept wherever, even if it was under an airplane. And Frank, of course, was tragically killed, and Carol McKenna became our district director. Carol McKenna and I, and her husband Jack, and my husband, we worked side by side for years at camps and meetings and other functions that went on for Farmers Union. Of course, they're both gone, and it's kind of tough some days to see how these friends of yours are all passing away. But then you see some of the people whose children have come up through the camping program. And my husband was a rural electric director for 27 years. Got to know Joe Matthews quite well. And right now I'm a board member for Area 4 Senior Nutrition. And I guess I kind of feel like Senator McGovern does, that we have to keep these children fed. I think we need to keep our older Americans fed too, and encourage more people to use the senior nutrition program. So that's what I'm working with now, alongside still working with the camps. I've seen some good times and some bad times, some sad times during our camping program. The year my son was on the Junior Advisory Council, one of the council members was killed in a car accident. That doesn't only affect that family, it affects the whole Farmers Union family. When I lost my husband, Farmers Union was instrumental for backing me up and being there for me. I'm thankful that my daughter could be here with us tonight, and her husband. But maybe I feel like maybe I should have been home for graduation.
We're glad you're here.
What's that?
We're glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm glad those of you that came are here too. And I worked with Ben too, and I remember him singing, "Somebody put glue on my saddle." Is that what it was? He sang that many times, and I remember one night when he couldn't find his guitar at state camp. Do you remember that, Arlene? But we found his guitar. We always enjoyed that when the board comes out. Now the board comes out all the time to state camp, and has to spend a whole week there. So I don't know what else to say. I've enjoyed working with people, and I don't plan on giving up yet. But I'm still a church organist. Done that for over 30 years and keep myself busy. I live 20 miles from Morristown now. I live in McIntosh. But everybody's got to be somewhere. We even live in McIntosh, but we hit the news a couple of weeks ago. We lost our courthouse, the last brick building in the state of South Dakota. And that was the only time in the night that I didn't get up to see which way the fire trucks were going. And I rolled over and went back to sleep, and something woke me up, and I just sat up in bed, and I knew where the fire was. The courthouse was just a block away from me. So, even if you live out in western South Dakota where there isn't very many people, there's a lot of excitement goes on. So I hope to continue working with the young people in the camping program. And I've enjoyed all the years that I have, and I really appreciate this. Thank you, Julia and Bonnie. and whoever else is responsible.
Congratulations, Grace. You're very deserving. In closing, we want to make mention of folks who belong to a society that we call our Mentor Society. It's a unique group of folks who have committed a 3-year commitment of $1,000 each to our Farmers Union Foundation program for the education youth programs. And we have always made mention that we will mention them at all of our events. So if you'll bear with me, there are 17 of them, but Harold and Pauline Shoneman, Kirk and Craig Shoneman and their families, Connie and Jerome Jacobs, Jerry and Carolyn Pettick, John and Margaret Sumption, Eunice Foster, Lori Fulton, Debbie Melanie Zomke, Larry and Kathy Bergen, Matt and Helen Sutton, Bart and Julie Bartling, Marion Van Zant, Jim Berg, Wayne Barcher, Dennis Weiss, Gerald and Alice Lang, and Reverend Bob Holum, who is a minister in Washington, D.C., and who went through our camping program many years ago. Also tonight, I'd like to recognize 2 folks that are here that serve on Chuck's Groth's Cooperative Legacy Advisory Board, and that's Merlin Van Walligan and John Miller. And so they were here tonight. I hope they're still here. There they are. And they're very So we'd like to thank all those who are supportive of our foundation. And with that, I'd also like to thank Bernie for emceeing this event tonight. You're a true friend of Farmers Union, and we are very thankful for you and participating not only tonight, but this afternoon as well. And thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you, Ben, for the opportunity again. It's great to have you in here, and so you can stop in on occasion to see us. We enjoy that. And I'd like to thank you again all for coming, and we hope for another wonderful event next year when we can honor Ben once again. So thank you for coming.